Good afternoon. His Excellency the Ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, executives of Art Dubai, Commissioner of the Global Art Forum, co-directors of the forum, speakers and gathered friends. Welcome to Global Art Forum, I'm Not a Robot, the Singapore edition. My name is Ona Haja and I'm the Executive Director of ArtScience Museum. And on behalf of my whole team here, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you here for one of the more ambitious public programs that we've staged in the ArtScience Museum for some time. Global Art Forum Singapore is a partnership between Art Dubai and ArtScience Museum that featured a stunning robotic performance by Sugweg Chong last night, a 3-day conference which we're kicking off today, and a film screening program. This edition of Global Art Forum, titled I'm Not a Robot, is all about an investigation of the opportunities, complexities, trepidations, and other anxieties of artificial intelligence, automation technologies, and robotics. These are themes that are quite familiar to us here at ArtScience Museum. We've explored aspects of those themes in a large-scale exhibition last year called Human Plus, The Future of Our Species, and other parts of this topic in an exhibition in 2016 called Big Bang Data. And Singapore is an apt place to be having this conversation. Of course, Singapore has an ambition to become the world's first smart nation. And to do this, it needs to harness the power of networks, of big data, and information technologies to improve people's lives, to create economic opportunities, and to build closer communities. To do so, Singapore's government and its private sector is developing not only its technological capabilities through initiatives like AI Singapore, but also its sociological understanding of the ethics and governance issues raised by automation, artificial intelligence, and big data. Against this fascinating backdrop here in Singapore, I'm Not a Robot is inviting both local and international speakers and practitioners to reflect on how automation and artificial intelligence is going to change our current age. The conference component of the Global Art Forum takes place over 3 days, starting this afternoon. We then continue all day tomorrow, and we culminate on Sunday afternoon. And throughout these 3 days, we'll be welcoming nearly 25 artists, technologists, scientists, futures practitioners, filmmakers, writers, and cultural critics from around the world and across Singapore. Together, we'll be exploring the opportunities and the challenges posed by technologies that not only have the power to transform our lives, but also may pose an existential danger. I'm thrilled that all 4 co-directors of Global Art Forum Singapore are with us this afternoon. Marlies Worth, Noah Rafford, and of course, Shumon Basar, the Commissioner of Global Art Forum. Shumon has been running Global Art Forum at Art Dubai for nearly a decade. He's a writer, curator, and cultural critic. He's editor-at-large of Tamp magazine, a contributing editor at Bidun magazine, and director of the format program at the AA School, amongst other roles. His most recent book, co-authored with Douglas Copeland and Hans Ulrike Briest, is The Age of Earthquakes, a guide to the extreme present. So, to help us begin our journey, please help me welcome Shumon Basar.
Thank you so much, Honor. Thank you all for being here today. It's really thrilling to bring the Global Art Forum here at ArtScience Museum and partner with them for this new chapter of I Am Not a Robot. I'm not sure how many of you may have attended a Global Art Forum before, so just in case you hadn't, I thought I'd provide some context. The forum started in 2007 alongside Art Dubai, which is the most global of art fairs in the Middle East and the North Africa region. Since that moment, the forum has been taking what we call the cultural temperature of our current moments in time. 500 of the world's most compelling minds have been invited to think out loud. We're building a growing map of knowledge and imagination. Because every place in the world is also imaginary, and every imaginary is a place in its own world, we uncover blind spots in the past which have been forgotten or erased from history. Continuity for us is much more important than novelty. As such, there are always overlaps or echoes between the different editions. Guests often come back, building up a kind of collective memory. Previous editions have dealt with media, language, historiography, technology, the future, and trade. It's a continuous conversation which ricochets back and forth, high and low, between obvious and obscure. For example, if you combine technology, the future, and trade, one outcome is automation. So automation draws on the radical possibilities of technology, the envisioning of a different future, and its impact is often most felt substantially in the worlds of work, labor, industry, and trade. So I Am Not a Robot started at the 2017 Serpentine Galleries Marathon in London, nearly a year ago. It then debuted in Dubai this February, and then continued 3 days in March at Art Dubai, featuring philosophers, musicians, artists, curators, policymakers, filmmakers, technologists, and many, many more. I urge you to visit our website if you would like to listen to the podcasts. Everything's been recorded and is online. I'm Not a Robot has been programmed by myself with my amazing two co-directors, the chief futurist at the Dubai Future Foundation, Noah Rafford, and Marlies Wirth, who's an extraordinary curator at the Mack Museum in Vienna. You'll meet them both in a matter of minutes and also get to know what they do in greater depth over the next few days. So Honor mentioned Singapore. I thought I'd mention something about the UAE and Dubai. So Dubai and UAE have made bold declarations regarding automation, from initiating the first artificial intelligence cabinet minister at the beginning of this year, or indeed employing the blockchain in government services, to, of course, the infamous Dubai police robot. Like Singapore, there are ambitions towards becoming a smart city with data acting as its main operating resource. So the reasons to stage this edition of the forum here in Singapore, and more specifically at the ArtScience Museum, are, I believe, quite numerous. On the one hand, the UAE and Singapore are future-facing countries of a particular laboratory-like scale, where the inevitability of automation is being written into national policy. Then there's also the necessity to think about technology outside of its own echo chamber. This is where cultural imagination plays a crucial role in alerting us to the unintended consequences of the future. Our program here at the ArtScience Museum, as Honor said, has been co-curated between ourselves and Honor and her team. And we combine guests from Beijing, Berlin, Paris, London, New York, Vienna, and Dubai, with many, many notable figures here from Singapore. We very much hope you enjoy it. Just a few thanks. It's been a huge collective effort to bring this together. So I want to extend my and Art Dubai's deepest thanks to everyone here at the ArtScience Museum, to Honor, to Nina, to Stacy, to Zin, to Ayn, to Magdalene, and many, many others. To everyone at the back, the tech and the AV and the facilities team, thank you so much for putting all this together, and we look forward to working with you over the next few days. To the Art Dubai team, Benny, Ben, Fatima, Nicole, and Emily, and of course to the UAE Embassy of Singapore and the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy for their very generous support of the Global Art Forum before and in the future. A little bit of housekeeping before I move things on. If you could please turn your phones to silent right now, that would be very appreciated, thank you. And we're using the hashtag #IamNotARobot. And if you also hashtag GAF12, that would be great, because then it would add to the Global Art Forum's archive as well. So I'm now going to introduce one of the two co-directors, who's going to tell us a little bit about what happened earlier on in this year And then Noah's going to talk about how, what kind of possible bridge we're looking at from our discussions and presentations back in Dubai to what we might be encountering here in the ArtScience Museum and in Singapore over the next 3 days. Will you please join me in welcoming my first co-director, Marlies Wirth. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Marlies. As mentioned, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. Thank you, firstly, to Honor and Shumon yet again to include me in this amazing adventure. As it was mentioned, I'm a curator in Vienna at the MAC, which stands for Museum of Applied Arts and Contemporary Art. And it couldn't be more far away from technology museums and science museums like these and cities like Dubai and Singapore. So Vienna is really old school in many ways, far from being a smart city. That's why it's of utmost importance for us at the MAC to include technology and to thinking about the future and artificial intelligence and how to include those technologies in a meaningful way into our lives. And we founded the Vienna Biennale for that reason in 2015. And last year's edition was titled Robots Work Our Future. I'm going to tell you more about that tomorrow in my own talk. But yeah, that's being the background why I even got invited by Shumon to join Global Art Forum Dubai earlier this year. And we focused on different notions of artificial intelligence also in a cultural perspective. So it's of utmost importance to the Global Art Forum to join speakers of different fields, not only artists talking to artists or technologists to other scientists, but to bring them all together on one podium. And I hosted particularly 2 sessions concerning artists and how they relate to the topics and also which role design played in this regard. And I will keep you no longer and ask Noah now to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I will just echo the thanks of my colleagues. It's such a pleasure to be here in one of what is my favorite parts of the Global Art Forum process, which is this ongoing dialogue all around a common theme with sometimes overlapping participants, but starting in one place and then, as the future itself is doing, rolling gradually eastwards. And I think that that's one of the interesting things from when this conversation began, I believe at the Serpentine, originally in London, and then did it substantially so in Dubai, and now that we're here, this tells a very interesting story, I think, about how the global conversation around artificial intelligence is unfolding, not from an operational perspective, because, you know, we have tech crunches and Wired magazines full of that, but really from a meaning perspective, and from perhaps, if you will, a sociological or even emotional perspective. So much of the debates around AI in popular culture are focused on, you know, will it dominate us or will we dominate it? And a lot of these dialogues come from Silicon Valley, which for better or for worse is often accredited to being the source of major innovations for artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the like. But of course, as you all know, and many of you are probably participating in, vast amounts of resources are being pushed into both theoretical and applied machine learning, artificial intelligence, not just in Silicon Valley, but also here in the East, in Singapore, in China, Japan, other areas as well, and then applications, quite aggressive applications such as those we're pursuing in Dubai and the UAE. So I think with that comes this very interesting opportunity to start to interrogate, well, what role is this playing in the societies that we are trying to create? And that's fundamentally a cultural question. And so this was very much what we explored in Dubai around if we are starting to have a larger, more sophisticated, more informed dialogue around what the cultural meaning of artificial intelligence might be, how we are choosing to apply it in a particular context of our societies today and going forward, then I feel like we really cracked that open perhaps a little bit in Dubai, starting to, if you will, just socialize the notion that, well, when we even think about artificial, well, intelligence, of course, there's a vast amount of philosophical and even cognitive science background around different kinds of intelligence and different kinds of senses of self in relationship to others, in relationship to our family, in relationship to our societies. And therefore, as we conceptualize an AI emerging in the West, it might be fundamentally different than an AI that emerges in Singapore or Beijing or Dubai or Sao Paulo or wherever that might be. And so we began that conversation in Dubai, and because ultimately, as we are moving further east and getting deeper into these dialogues, I think it's extremely appropriate to be continuing those conversations here, where you know the future is unfolding, and many of these questions are actually going to be decided. So, Really pleasure to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you very much to Shimon, Marlies, and Noah for helping kind of kick us off on what we hope is going to be a quite provocative journey in our first session today, which is called, Is This the Right AI? And this first session is including two of Singapore's leading foresight practitioners. They're also two very good friends, and I think friends of the Global Art Forum's kind of wider context in Dubai. The topic that we're going to be talking about in this first session is reflecting on the pitfalls and potentials of automation and artificial intelligence in our current moment. Cheryl is going to be introducing Singapore's specific and distinctive approach to technological innovation, examining the multiple identities that governments play in an age of disruptive technology. To begin, Cho Fan Lee will explore the promises and paranoias of AI, machine learning, network systems, and robotics. Cho Fan Lee is the Principal Strategist at the Centre for Strategic Futures in the Prime Minister's Office of the Singapore Government. In that capacity, he supports and advises on the Centre's foresight research and helps translate this into strategy at various government platforms. He's also played key foresight roles and business development roles in both the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the China office of the Infocom Development Authority of Singapore. Cho Fan is going to ask what it is about AI that triggers such primal desires and fears. So please welcome to the stage, Cho Fan Lee.
Hi, can you hear me? All right, good, great. All right, good afternoon. I'm Cho Fan. Oh, sorry. Yes. Oh, let me talk, regardless. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about things a little bit further out. So it is going to be slightly whimsical. All right, it's going to be slightly whimsical, but it is a serious topic. But sometimes you have to suspend what we call the weight, the deadening weight of evidence and belief sometimes, because you want to imagine what's around the corner. As a friend of mine once said, right, I sort of know what's around the corner, I just don't know where the corner is sometimes. Okay, so we're going on a quick journey to try to look at tomorrow's landscapes. There is not going to be that much structure, all right, but as we go down some bright highways and some dark alleys, all right, we might encounter more questions than answers, but as I found out over time, right, a good question is worth more than its weight in gold. A good question tells you some things, okay, leads you down some paths and gives you some surprising discoveries. And we might find out that that is so close to what it means to be human, and that's how I might wrap this up a little bit. So I'm trying to show you a little bit of the end first. Okay, I will just continue here, okay. Now here, you might feel that with a topic like artificial intelligence, that there are already so many stories, so many competing narratives out there. It is a tangled mess of desires and fears, all right? And what I like to do is push back the jungle, which should be appearing right behind, all right? Push back the jungle and have a clearing so we all can step back, right? We can step back in this clearing and take a good look. What is it about AI, specifically artificial general intelligence, AGI, that triggers such primal fears and desires in us? Okay, so, can we click to the next one? Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you. Now, humans have a very difficult relationship with intelligence, and that is because intelligence has been used as a fig leaf throughout time to justify domination, to justify destruction. Now, to say someone is or is not intelligent is not just a comment on their mental faculties. It is also a judgment of what we permit them to do. All right, and now this is very sensible. I I want my doctors, I want my engineers to be, competent. I don't want them to be stupid. But the dark side is this. The dark side is that the lack of intelligence is also used to decide what we can do to others, what we can do to them. And throughout history, those deemed less intelligent have been colonized, they have been enslaved, they even have been sterilized and murdered, all right? And here I want to expand our understanding of intelligences, not just as human intelligences, but also to species like octopus, like dolphins, all right, the great apes and so on. How are we really treating intelligences? Now, no wonder AGI pushes our buttons. And I'm just going to name 4 of them. So let's start. Life. The first is life. There's some desire to live forever. Okay, you should know this guy, Ray Kurzweil. All right, he's been around for a while, and he might be around for a little bit, as he wants to be. Some desire to live forever in human form, some desire to be uploaded into a singularity, and some fear, on the other hand, taking away death, taking away illness, robs us of some essence of what it means to be human, some truth about what it means to be human with a capital H. Now, I personally think this is fetishizing suffering. The second is time. Keynes, some of you may remember Keynes' promise. Keynes promised automation, freeing us from work, I think it was a 15-hour work week, into a life of ease. Of course, we know how that happened. But here's the thing. These promises are coming back. What would we do with all the time on our hands if that actually happened? Will humans feel worthless? Yuval Harari, the author of Homo Deus, Homo sapiens, all right, he asked this really sticky question. If automation does everything, what do we do with all the useless humans? Because so much of what we think in terms of what it means to be a good human being, something useful, is tied up in work. In our identity composes a lot of work. The third one is desire. This is taken from the movie Ex Machina, all right? This is the male gaze, all right? This desire is a sticky mix, all right, of desire and fear, playing out ad nauseum in popular media, and it is manifestly male anxiety over female empowerment. The fourth and most potent is power. We want clever tools to help us do more, to help us achieve our dreams, but we fear it will also help us achieve our nightmares. Now, this trend plays out prominently in many movies. The Matrix, this is from 2001, A Space Odyssey, or as fears voiced by public thinkers like Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking. Actually, what we want are God slaves. We want them to be superhuman in capacity, but always sort of subservient to us. All right. So the G in AGI might as well stand for God here, right? All right. Right here. It's a placeholder for us to project our shadows. And I think we need to be aware of this because AI has been through several winters and several springs. I myself was trained doing neural networks before it got sexy to be called AI. What I'm trying to say is such questions were asked 50 years ago, 60 years ago even. All right, this is not new. With every spring and every winter, things came, things went. But I think I want us to realize that we may be getting ahead of ourselves because what we have today is ANI, artificial narrow intelligence. These systems have a very high intelligence for specific tasks, such as tracking huge amounts of data to identify humans' faces and emotions, but they cannot tell a plausible story explaining the motivations for a person's behavior. It is what I call an idiot savant. All right, and this is taken from the Elementary, all right, Sherlock Elementary, all right. It is an idiot savant type of intelligence because it performs far better than human beings in some narrow areas, all right, while failing to exhibit some common sense. Now, savants, geniuses, what I call the neuroatypical, all right. The civilizational contribution from the neurodivergent over millennia is formidable and often decisive in science and technology. And we need savants in spades. We need more of them because they help to push humanity's frontier forward. There are just not enough of them to go around. And sometimes society tends to punish them. And there are many examples in history, to punish their eccentric mannerisms, and we call them idiots. Actually, in this context, idiot savant intelligences feel a pressing need. Imagine it, intelligence as a service, scanning millions of scientific papers, looking for trends and hypotheses on a possible cure for cancer, lying buried in the millions of clinical trials out there. Now, if you roll back to 2014, there was a little, maybe a documentary, a little blurb on my son's silent killer. It was just this computer scientist that couldn't figure out why his son was falling ill with some sort of neurodegenerative disease. But just by crunching through tons and tons of data, they found all he needed to do was take a common off-the-shelf asthma pack, and it could directly apply to his son's problem. All right. But the amount of data crunching was peculiar to that man's talent. Imagine if we could have this as a service, just to crunch to and help us find things, what I call a savant as a service. This is also happening in Beijing right now. All right, this was published, I think, last week in SCMP, South China Morning Post, where AI system scrutinizes brain scans. They are invisible to doctors. This helps them to determine the likelihood when coma patients will wake. Now, in case you're wondering, the system helped the best neurologists in China identify coma patients that will wake up after it was initially determined that they have no hope of recovery. How did they do it? By going through their brain scans, by going through their facial tics, lots of data that are invisible or just overwhelming for a human brain or a human eye to pick up. I think we need much more intelligences like this to help us. In case it's not obvious, this is not human intelligence in the way we know it. Machine learning has no context for what it is doing. It cannot do anything else. Remember, they are vastly superior to us at certain specialized tasks. But the day that they can rival a human's general ability is some way off, if ever. We humans are not the best at much, but we are second best at an impressive range of things. Moving on, where it gets interesting is EI, emotional intelligences. You may have seen this picture floating around. Humans are quite capable of self-deception. Any of you in a relationship will know that. Humans are quite capable of self-deception. And machine intelligence can get to know us better than we know ourselves, using signals we don't know that we are producing to know our unspoken feelings. Now, this is from Emotion Research Lab in Valencia, Spain. It uses facial analysis software to analyze just via your phone camera our micro-expressions to translate in real time emotions people are really feeling. It can do this in a sea of humanity like this. Imagine this in an election room, all right? To give you a literal heat map of what people are feeling. This new industry is called neuropolitics, and it is arguably as old as time. Getting to the nub of what people really are feeling from all your facial tics, all your hesitations, your pauses between question and reply. Now, I think we need to get on the right side of developing emotional intelligences. We humans are very easy to hack. Fake news and misinformation campaigns out there show it is not too difficult to find our buttons and press them. Developing emotional intelligences to mediate between us and the world, to guide us if we are being hacked without our knowledge, to analyze and gently chide us if we are stuck in an emotional rut. This is something a bit like Demons, all right? Sorry, the feedback. Demons from Philip Pullman's Dark Materials. Or for those of us in Asia, this is Doraemon and his friend Nobita, or Xiao Ding Dang and Da Xiong, as the way most of us in this powder will remember it. Think about it. Emotional and savant intelligences as a service, side by side. It's almost like having a life coach and a Sherlock by your side. Now, good life coaches, and savants, by the way, they're really not that common and non-scalable. Perhaps now we can scale it. Perhaps now we can truly be our better natures. Now, talking about natures, what is so special about human nature? Now, because of my personal history in human transformation movements, neural networks, and social identities, I'm keen not just on the dance between technology and science, all right, on one hand, politics and economics on one hand, philosophy on another hand, and religions and spirituality on the other hand. I actually want to find out how might artificial intelligences help us discover what it means to be human. And it is a kind of shifting thing, by the way, all right? It is a moving goalpost. What are the political, religious, and economic implications when intelligences understand me better than myself? Now, I realize I'm inching into the G territory of AGI. But here, I want to bring up a distinction. I think we misunderstand the distinction between intelligence and cognition. Cognition needs bodies to interact with, to work out context. Machine learning and algorithms lack context. We are finding out that cognition is not just a disembodied thing, a great processor, some digital archive uploaded in the cloud and living forever. Cognitive science has been discovering, all right, that cognition needs an embodied presence in the world to interact with and to learn. Now, what does it mean in our new world here? Embodied presences are increasingly IoT, Internet of Things, M2M, machine-to-machine information. It is learning how to work with the world through machines and sensors, but it is also the natural world. And that includes you, me, it includes us. A previous ArtScience show was Human Plus, with more sensors inside us, working with our biochemistry, getting to know us truly and deeply. We are also becoming the natural bodies of this larger algorithm, all right? And we are the programmer, the programmed, and deprogrammed. We will find a new way of being part of something larger, maybe a part of her. You might say, I am naive, and that the answer to technology is not more technology. You might not want the sharper ends of human behavior to be domesticated away. You might like it bloody in the tooth and nail. You probably sum up the spirit of Tyler Durden from Fight Club. Going back to Yuval, all right. Yuval Harari claims learning how to cooperate is what allowed humans to be so successful. How do we cooperate? Above the Dunbar number. Having language, the ability to weave fictions such as nations, money, religions, legal institutions. Those fictions help us to scale, help us to cooperate globally. Now, the thing about machines and algorithms and her, all right, they don't believe in fictions. They don't need fictions. They remain self-interested. And because of that, they will hit a roadblock because there's no context. What I think is she will encourage our plasticity, our innate curiosity, because she needs us. Humans are unpredictable. We get the benefit of surprises, happy accidents, unexpected connections and intuitions, and when we interact, when we cooperate with others and collaborate, we multiply those opportunities. She needs us as context to learn how to cooperate, to co-evolve with us, and both of us will get better at it too. It being the business of life. Remove humans from the equation, and we and she are less complete. Now, thank you very much for staying open-minded with me about my little share about the future. The people around me typically think that I'm a robot. And I realize the irony of saying what I'm saying, right? That I'm not a robot, but I hope I at least tickle your mind. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Cho Pham, for that fantastic provocation that took us through, I think, some of the kind of key topics, issues, also kind of motifs and themes that we'll return to again and again throughout the next 3 days. Given its culture of embracing technology as part of its project of nation building, could Singapore's trajectory provide lessons for governance and ethics in an age of disruptive technology? Well, these are questions that are very familiar to our next speaker, Cheryl Chung. Like Cho Pham, Cheryl has held key foresight positions in different departments of the Government of Singapore. Right now, she's the co-director of executive education at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. She also heads the school's strategic planning department and is building futures research and its teaching capabilities in the Future Ready Singapore project. To talk to us about the role of government in an age of disruptive technology, such as AI. Please welcome Cheryl Chung.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Is everyone doing okay? Everybody looks a bit stunned from up here. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes sharing a little bit about the role of government in the age of disruptive tech. And Chofan and I have worked together many, many years, and I think it's quite serendipitous, that we're here together on this occasion, but also that we'll provide slightly different perspectives on this issue. So just as Chofan talked very much about the perspective from AI in a way, I would kind of flip that, right, and look at the perspective from a very large entity we call government. So I usually start, every time I'm invited to a technology-related conference, I usually start with this slide. And if technology is the question, actually, it's the answer, what was the question? And I think that's something which is good to kind of set the context of what we're trying to do over the next few days. And I hope that we'll be able to also think about what are some of the, like what Chofan said, the importance of a good question, but also think about the perspective of the entity that is trying to ask some of these large questions or answer some of these large questions that AI poses. And continuing, again serendipitously on Chofan's whimsical theme, I'm going to start you off with a children's poem. How many of you are familiar with this poem, The Blind Man and the Elephant? I used to love it as a kid. And so this poem is The Blind Man and the Elephant, and if you want to take a quick read of it, it's here. Essentially, it's the story of 6 men who are blind, and they encounter an elephant. And each of them puts their hand on a different part of the elephant, and depending on which part they touch, they come away thinking that the elephant is this thing, right? So the person who puts his hand on the tail says, oh, the elephant must be like a rope because I feel a rope, right? The person who puts his hand on the side says, oh, the elephant must be like a wall because I feel it's like a wall. So the theme of my presentation is going to be governments are a bit like elephants, not just because they're large and sometimes lumbering, also because depending on which part of the government you touch, you come away thinking that the government is a very different thing. At this point, I wanted to make a quick distinction between government and governance. This presentation, we're going to talk a lot about government and the role of government, but I think the other big question that goes beyond just the role of government and actually is maybe a little bit more of a question for society at large is also the question of governance. And the distinction in my mind is if you think about government, this elephant that makes decisions, then you think of governance as the process under which these decisions and these choices are made. And the reason why it's important is that if you talk about something like Smart Nation, a lot of Smart Nation initiatives are in city optimization, right? So some sort of like, traffic management or something like that. You may be very happy with the outcome of the decision making, but you may be completely blind to how that decision is made. And that actually calls into question a lot of legitimacy challenges for governments, but also for corporates and so on, right? Because if you have governance opaque, in public policy school, you talk a lot about good governance, you talk about that being transparent, consistent, and all these kinds of things, then that actually poses quite a lot of challenges for technology and the adoption of technology over the long term. But today, my presentation, like I said, is going to be on governments as an elephant and talking about the different parts of the government you can touch and what these different parts of the elephant look like. So just to give you a quick map, I'm going to talk about 5 different roles or identities in a way of government in the age of disruptive tech, and I kind of take you through quickly each one. What I'm hoping to do is also to share a few examples, at least from, mainly from Singapore, but also a few internationally, of where government and technology kind of intersect, right? And how does that look like from my perspective? So the first one is government as a user of technology. At a public policy school, actually, this is probably where we get the most questions, from governments around the world. We see these technology, we see the potential of technology, but we have a challenge in how to adopt it, right? So there's one big question about what does government as a user of tech start to look like? One nifty example that I quite like from Singapore is the URA Digital Planning Lab. Right, so in this particular example, it's the URA is the Urban Redevelopment Authority, for those of you who are not from here. And it's using a lot of digital planning to look at the city as a whole and try to gain a better understanding of how we live, work, and play. And one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this particular example is because very common when you're looking at the artificial narrow intelligence, kind of possibilities like what Chao Fan was saying, you actually tend to look at it from a city optimization perspective. So basically what you're doing is you're using technology to improve the business of running a city, but not necessarily the forward planning of running a city, and the anticipatory functions of the city. So to use that as a planning tool is actually quite interesting. One of the things you also start to see is that in addition, of course they started very much with simulating the city and the data mapping and all that kind of thing. But the next phase of what they started to do was to look at the behavior and maybe foolhardily try to map the behavior of the bugs in the system called the humans, right, who are running around and trying to use this system. And I think that brings a nice segue to the next example, which is the Ministry of Manpower CoLab. They started as a behavioral insights team, but increasingly are starting to bring in the data analytics aspects. And I think those two things are important to bring together because you can have all the tech you want, but if you don't have also redesigned the business process that accompanies it, then for government as a user of tech becomes a little bit hampered, I would say, or you start to measure things that are not quite there. One of the fun examples that I always like to share is we had this example where we tried to give elderly residents Fitbits, or some version of a Fitbit. And what happens is that not all elderly residents will actually faithfully wear the Fitbit. What some of them do is they might attach it on the dog, or on their, grandchild or someone else, and actually, and give it to somebody else, right? And then you have this data coming back of all these amazingly active elderly people in Singapore who, obviously this campaign was a phenomenal success, right? So you can imagine many variations of this kind of thing where, it's not just about the implementation of the tech, it's also about redesigning the way the tech interacts with somebody in their day-to-day life. Another example of, and this is an international example, another example of government as a user of technology is also in the space of poverty alleviation, right? So I asked the question, if technology is the answer, actually what was the question? And for governments, actually one of the big questions is how do we alleviate poverty? How do we look at some of the social issues that we face and use technology to intervene in them, So what I would love to see, if you chase the money trail in AI, a lot of it is in the security space, in the smart cities space. I would love to see more in the social space. And what does that start to look like in this next phase of development? The second part of the elephant we want to touch is government as a regulator. And in the space of disruptive tech, this becomes almost sometimes a little bit contentious because usually what happens is that the new wine of technology doesn't quite fit into the old wineskin of regulation, and then government is sometimes seen as slow or not quick to react and so on. And usually the example I would point out is also that you don't want government to react too fast, because if government reacts too fast, sometimes that totally kills business opportunity, and sometimes that creates technology obsolescence. Because they lock in standards or protocols that actually, they were a little bit premature, right? And then they kind of get evolved out of quite quickly. So again, to talk about an example in Singapore, I always use autonomous vehicles examples just because it's a policy area that I'm very familiar with. So when we were looking at the autonomous vehicle policies when we were in the Ministry of Transport, one challenge is that you're looking at a technology that could basically lead to a sea change in regulation, right? You are going from a policy that is driver-centered, so the liabilities, the rules, the regulations are all centered around the driver, to a question mark centered, a set of regulations. And that's a big sea change, right? And it's not really a decision that government necessarily wants to make at one fell swoop. Because it can be quite disruptive and actually quite destructive as well. So I like this particular example because this is what they did with exemption orders. Essentially what an exemption order does is that it kind of gives you a little regulatory space to play around, and it's easy to see in a road space because that gives you a physical ring fence, right? To think about, okay, first way they started, for those of you who are familiar with NUS U-Town, they've been testing at NUS U-Town for years and years and years. And then they slowly, in 2015, opened it up to One North, and then recently the Minister for Transport also said, okay, now we will look at opening it up to mixed-use residential areas and so on. So, once we are convinced that the NUS students were not knocked down and, and are still alive, then we moved to One North, and then when we were convinced that the One North people who work there are still alive, then we will move on to mixed-use residential and so on. Another example, of course, is the MAS regulatory sandbox for fintech. So this is the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And regulatory sandboxes for financial tech is quite common. And one reason for that is the same reason why you would ring fence autonomous vehicles, right? It's because you want to maintain the integrity and overall safety of the system. That's why the elephant is there in the first place, right? For that stability and for that consistency. But at the same time, you need to find a little part of the elephant that is actually willing to take some risk and has the appetite and ability to absorb that risk. The third part of the elephant I want to talk about is government as a promoter of tech. And I always start with this slide, which is not particularly, government budgeting is it's not a particularly interesting field. But you'd be surprised at actually how much power, in some sense, it has, and its ability to shape developments, right? So this is quite a nice example from Singapore, which is the Research Innovation Enterprise Plan. It's basically our research and development plan. And what I like is, I've done something strange. Okay, I like this bit, which is 13% white space funding, which essentially means 13% in year zero. I think what I'm saying as a planner is actually I don't know what to do with the 13%, right? Which is actually quite an intelligent way of budgeting and quite a difficult thing to pass through politicians, But I think that also gives a sense of the kind of humility that we will need as government to also be able to say that, hey, I have this grand ambition to promote something, but the reality is I don't know what it's going to look like. And I want to be open to the possibilities of what these things could be in the future. And there are mundane budget tools that you could use to affect some of these things. Of course, the more common way we think about government as a promoter is really in more of a branding, marketing kind of initiative, right? So, this is essentially from the speech where PM Lee launched the Smart Nation initiative. But, he had set out this very, very big, grand, bold vision, and you can criticize it for being, you start with the vision and then, everybody's scrambling to figure out what that means. But you imagine trying to do Smart Nation without that declaration of a vision, right? Sometimes you also need to kind of wave the flag as a starting point to also galvanize and energize activity around it. So there's also a role for government to stand up and say, okay, actually we would like to do this, as part of our strategy. It's quite common, again, not just for smart, Singapore, of course, brands itself as a smart nation, but for smart cities, that becomes, again, a very important promoter kind of tool as they use that as a economic development differentiator, essentially. The fourth part of the elephant that I'd like to talk about is government as an enabler. And if I distinguish between the promoter role and the enabler role, I think about the promoter role more like the innovation policy, industry development kind of role. And the enabler role is almost like all the public good, almost infrastructure kind of provisions. There's also a role of government to put some of these things in place, because in the absence of some of these infrastructural investments, which are in classic economics are market failure, always will have a tendency to underinvest, then it actually becomes very difficult for the rest of society to kind of move on. Again, using a Smart Nation example, this is some of the milestones for the Smart Nation, some of the initiatives they put out. And the milestones, the timelines themselves are not particularly what I want to focus on. What I want to focus on is this aspect here to talk about the types of projects that they are looking at. And you can see from that a lot of these are platform kind of, I would say, public good, infrastructural related projects. The idea is that if we make a big push at e-payments, actually that enables a whole lot of other things to sprout up. So there is also, again, a very interesting role in terms of government to be almost I would say, loss leader, and a first adopter of some of these things to create essentially a market after them. In the write-up for this particular talk, Honor mentioned the Advisory Council for the Ethical Use of Data, but that's again another example of the kind of infrastructural, kind of development that we would want to look at. The last role and the last part of my little elephant is the leveler aspect, and I think that this is, from my perspective as a public policy school, also where public policy needs to catch up a little bit. There's a lot of conversation around the use of AI and how to deal with kind of public service reform in that sense. But every industrial revolution had a corresponding social revolution, right? And I think it's somewhat naive to think that this won't happen as well. So if we're looking at what is the redesign of social insurance, social welfare, social policy, then this is again something that we need to start to look at, because in the absence of it, you won't be able to adopt technology, because basically there will be increasingly more and more pushback, right? The more and more people left behind, the inequality issues will exacerbate. So I'm also pretty curious about what some of these aspects would look like. In Singapore, one common example, one popular example would be Skills Future, and you think about that as it's about reskilling, right? That essentially technology creates winners and losers, and how do you get people who basically are losers from the automation situation to become winners in a new set of skills and so on. There are, of course, also redistributive type interventions that you could do. Bill Gates is famously talked about his robot tax. And that's two ways of solving the re-education problem, right? The reskilling problem. Basically, Bill Gates as well, why don't we just tax capital and feed it to labor, right? Essentially. And another example being the Finnish experiment on universal basic income. And I think there's a lot of talk around what the idea of universal basic income, as well as the mechanics of how that would actually work, right? And the details of those mechanics are actually pretty important as well. So that brings me to the, more or less to the end of my presentation. And the reason why I wanted to talk about government as having these 5 different roles and 5 different identities is because I think sometimes when you're talking about, when you have a conference, which is quite tech-focused, there is sometimes this frustration, right? That you're dealing with a big entity like government that is stuck in many ways, right? Or doesn't move the way that you want it to. And what I'm hoping to do in this presentation is to talk about, to broaden up our idea of what government identity and the multiplicity in that identity and what that can look like. Because just as we can have we can have multiple identities that contradict themselves, and have these wide, and be patient with those contradictions. Governments also can have patience with those contradictions, and that actually opens up the possibility for us to do more things in the future. So, just as the regulatory role may contradict the promoter role, I think the real question is how do we interact with all those and have patience for those contradictions. Thank you very much.
Huge thanks to Cheryl for setting out, I think, some of the really crucial kind of practical, kind of contextual constraints of the conversations that we'll be having over the next few days here in Singapore, and perhaps how they might differ, but be complementary to some of the previous conversations in the I'm Not a Robot series in Dubai, in London, and the other locations. So Cheryl's going to stay in the room with us here because she is my co-chair for our second session, which we're going to kick off now. And the second session is called Are We an AI Nation? And this very much picks up on something that Cheryl raised in her talk, which is in July of this year, the Singapore government announced 2 key initiatives. An advisory council on the ethical use of AI and data, and separately to that, and in addition, a new research program on the governance of AI and data use. These initiatives both respond, I think, to concerns within the public about the way that artificial intelligence may have the power to deviate into unintended consequences. Perhaps some of the unintended consequences that Chorfan pointed to in his provocation. But they also underscore the very real need for regulatory frameworks to build public trust for emerging technologies. AI is just one example. Yet at the same time, there's no question that artificial intelligence is vital to Singapore's ambition to become the world's first smart nation. Bold technological research, which is being undertaken, in fact, by all of our universities here in Singapore, has significantly advanced Singapore's reputation for technological innovation internationally. Nanyang Technological University earlier this year announced another new AI research partnership, this time the first with the Chinese technology giant Alibaba. AI Singapore, who you'll hear from in a few moments, are charting whole new waters about upskilling people in Singapore in the basics of artificial intelligence. And these efforts seem to be paying off. Global consultancy company Accenture recently reported that by 2035, AI is projected to help double Singapore's economic growth. And increase productivity by 41%. So, you know, these are the context, I think, the waters that we're charting in this session. We've got 2 speakers who are going to be talking about what role AI might have in nation building. The first up is Sing-Ming Khoo. Sing-Ming leads alliances and partnerships for AI Singapore, an organisation that aims to anchor Singapore's national capabilities in artificial intelligence. They aim to create social and economic impact, grow local talent, and put Singapore on the world map in the area of AI. Sing-Ming himself has over a decade of experience working in mobile communications and interactive digital media before AI Singapore. He's held key roles in companies such as Nokia, Sony Ericsson, and Sony Music Entertainment. So to hear about AI Singapore's works, please welcome to the stage, Sing-Ming Khoo.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm always very happy not to be the first speaker because the speakers in front of me will set the context. So I'll be borrowing examples from Chorfan and Cheryl, which I worked with before in some capacity. So things like artificial general intelligence, artificial narrow intelligence, and there's actually one more that people keep talking about whenever you talk about AI and Terminator T2000 come into view is artificial super intelligence. But let's not talk about that right now. I'll also be talking about the 6 blind men and the elephant, which is a very apt example of how AI Singapore came into being. So my name is Sing-Ming. Again, I lead Partnership and Alliance for AI Singapore. So let me tell you a story. In late 2016, one blind man called National Research Foundation was in a room and decided to invite 6 of his friends to come together and talk about, there is this big elephant called AI. What am I going to do about it? But as you can see, there are 7 icons, so they decided to invite the 7th blind person to come in as well. Because AI is a very multidisciplinary elephant. what are we going to do about it? Today, I'm not going to talk about the history of AI. Shaofan shared a fair bit. In fact, this is the third winter for AI. AI exists in 1953, and with every winter and spring, we are now in the spring stage. The spring happened in 2011. So the six blind men say, spring is here. How are we going to extract the value of AI? As Shaofan shared about some of the philosophical, some of the technical challenges, one key thing you can always understand about Singapore is we are very pragmatic. So Shaofan and Cheryl paint the 50,000 feet, the 10,000 feet. What I'm going to share with you are all processes that were put into place to extract the value of AI, the 5,000 feet, right? So 6 coordinating agencies, seven, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, 6. I'm missing one icon here. It's okay. So there are 6 blind men who came in: EDB, IMDA, National Research Foundation, Smart Nation, Digital Government Office, MOH, IHIS, and SG Innovate, decided to come together and say, let us think about what we can do to extract the value of AI, and taking a cue about the fundamental questions. So we have 3 questions that we want to answer. 1, how do you build an AI-ready economy for Singapore? How do you build that supercharger to bolt onto the smart nation engine that we declare that we have been trying to build? That's question number 1. Number 2, government is in an interesting position. Government cannot regulate what they don't understand. They cannot set the laws and policies. They cannot do proper governance. So they want to be in the driver's seat. So what they want to do is what they want us to do is to answer the question, how do you harness AI in specific national impact projects? And number 3, Singapore continue to need to attract bright minds, companies, talents to come here. So we want to attract the top AI researchers, the top AI companies to come here. So we need to determine what kind of AI research is vital to Singapore. So these are the 3 questions that we look at when we set up this AI Singapore. Now, AI Singapore officially is sort of like a quasi-government task force for 5 years. So I'm from AI Singapore. I have 6 bosses, which conveniently then say, you have national KPIs for me to fulfill. So that is how AI Singapore was formed. A little bit about the logo. If you look at the logo, there are 3 roots behind, which is the laser pointer. This one? Oops. Okay, you can see that there are 3 roots below. 3 roots stands for the 3 questions that we are trying to answer, right? With the root blossoming into a tree that looks like AI Singapore, it's all about how Singapore can anchor and build our own national capability to survive in Industry 4.0. And the shape of the neuron is because we're dealing with data science, we're dealing with convolutional neural net. So AI Singapore then, what do? We work with the concentration of AI talents, which is in the universities. 6 universities in Singapore and including A-Star. So what do we want to do? We want to look at how AI will impact industry, how AI will impact governance and government, and what kind of research should we do. So the pragmatic Singapore, we have 3 areas that we are going to look at. We have been doing it for the past 1 year. We just passed our 1-year anniversary. So there are 3 key strategic thrusts that we look at. The first is AI innovation. So in AI innovation is all about helping the Singapore ecosystems, the companies, to adopt AI. Now, AI is, as I say, is not new. And any companies and all the individuals in Singapore, you probably have read about AI, but what does AI means to you? One of the more difficult questions whenever a company comes to adopting AI is, what's the value proposition for me? I mean, I have mouths to feed, I have revenue to grow, but what is the business value of AI? So AI innovation has this program called 100 Experiment. 100 Experiment is geared towards helping you to prove the business value of AI. More information about that. And along the same way, to groom AI talents, engineering talents. We already have a fair bit of AI researchers in the universities, but what we want to do to sustain the innovation engine is AI engineers. So along the way, as we do industry project, we also groom AI engineers at the same way. Second, AI technology. So I spoke about the government want to be in the driver's seat of what's happening. Singapore government also owns the largest data set. Singapore is a unique country, modern economy, but extremely little data sets. 6.5 million data sets. Those who does computer science would know that this is useless when it comes to training neural net. So, but at least the government still own it, so we then have an opportunity to look at driving large-scale AI projects. So what AI technology does is to perform the role of DARPA for Singapore. We will design, or we have designed, 3 long-term, long-range national research goals that spans 5 to 10 years in key domains. And the key domains have already been spelled out when we receive the funding. One will be in health, one will be in urban solution, and then the third one in finance. So why do we want to do the AI Grand Challenge? Now, besides giving the government front row seat in what's happening and also be part of the process to discover what are the technological surprises, we also want to look at what are the research bottlenecks so that we can directly feed back to our research institute, our academic institution, what to focus on. So the third one is a continuation of what we do typically in supporting research. So we will continue to look at investing in theoretical researchers, except in this case, with the 2 earlier work stream, it provides suitable guidance and suitable cue what kind of research will be suitable for Singapore. So I mentioned about 6 bosses. These are a snapshot of the national KPIs. So basically, Singapore being pragmatic to extract the value of AI. What does it mean? What kind of AI value do we want to extract? If we look from the right-hand side first, well, we want to continue to make Singapore a magnet when it comes to attracting the brightest to come to Singapore. So top-tier research publication, that is one of the key things that we want to continue to maintain. Now, with this effort of 6 people trying to build up that big elephant, what we're trying to do is to increase deployed smart technology into Singapore. Walk the talk. We claim to be a smart nation. Let's be smart about some of the things that we implement, right? Now, with the smart technology deploy, Singapore had about 100 over MNCs. What we want to do is to attract these MNCs to increase their R&D investment here. So R&D spending will come here, and with that correspondingly, we would have more foreign direct investment. We will also have local companies being able to do more with AI, and that will naturally value add to the economy. Value adding to the economy would then blah, 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 means more manpower can be spin off. Our academic institution then will be really training people and outputting people that will service the industry need and service the technology need. So there's a pragmatic way of us looking at what to do for the next 5 years, which is the period of the funding. Now the funding incidentally come from Cheryl's presentation, the RIE 2020, the 19 billion. So we're taking a little slice of it, is worth 150 million. So again, very pragmatic, give us a small sum of money, see what we can do with it, and then it will give us more if we do a good job. Right? So let's look successively into each of the pillars. I will start with the middle one first, the Grand Challenge. AI technology, right? So the whole intent is to design long-term national research goal. And in June of this year, we took 9 months of top-down, bottoms-up, many additional blind men all coming into the room to decide what kind of AI National Grand Challenge in health should we do. So in June, we launched the National AI Grand Challenge in Health, which reads, how can AI help primary care team stop or slow down the disease progression and complication development in 3H patient by 20% in 5 years? Hallmark of Singapore. We want the cake and eat it. We want the statement to be inspiring to the researchers. We want the statement to be impactful to the citizen, thinking why are they spending so much public money funding this? And since the government need to report back to the citizen, we need numerical targets. That's why this is a Singapore version of DARPA Grand Challenge Statement. The DARPA Grand Challenge Statement that they do is, can I make a car drive itself across the desert? It was as simple as that, but we like to complicate things. So this is the AI Grand Challenge. Now, after doing this, what we're trying to do is then to beef up on urban solution, and we are also trying to scope out what we want to do in finance. Okay, some of you may be asking, so what is 3H? 3H stands for hyperglycemia, hypertension, and hyperlipidemia. In some of the medical parlance, it's also known as DHL, diabetes, hypertension, lipidemia. Now, why do we want to look at 3H? Because it's one of the top 3 chronic diseases, and Singapore is always worried about the disease burden to societal spending. Okay? Singapore, as you know, is very small. There's only so much space that we can allocate to hospital, and then even with that, there is only so much people who wish to be nurses, who wish to be allied health workers, or who wish to be doctors. So we need a smarter way to help to solve all this disease burden. So beside 3H, there's also dementia and there's also cancer, but we decided to focus on 3H for now because 3H is largely treatable. The problem with 3H is, by the age of 35, the typical Singaporean would kena 1H. Kena meaning you would be afflicted with 1H. Once you have 1H, the other 2H is not far down the road. Okay? The issue here right now is the detection is being loaded into the secondary healthcare. Secondary healthcare meaning the hospitals and the specialists. What we want to do is to use AI, use intelligence system to codify some of the detection system, to build neural net models and prediction models, and pass it on to the primary care teams, which are the physicians, the GPs, the clinic, so that they can detect early and they can predict with a reasonable amount of accuracy that this particular person is showing signs of diabetes or the other 2H itself, so that the person can take active intervention in slowing down the progression. So this is what 3H is about, right? Now, how we're going to fund this, we have already announced in June. By the end of September, we'll be closing the research proposals. Now, because this is considered very difficult problems, we actually invite research consortia. In fact, no, we need research consortia to come in. Individual professors submitting proposals, well, unless he's Geoffrey Hinton, I don't think we are going to approve that. So basically, you're going to have different teams of researchers coming in. We're probably going to fund, we think, based on the talent that we have existing in Singapore, and we think 3 teams actually will be chosen. And out of the 3 teams, then we will fund them 5 million apiece to conduct laboratory research, efficacy research for the next 1 to 2 years. At the end of the second year itself, we will do a DARPA-style gatekeep by telling us, what have you done with the money I've given to you? Prove me that it works, right? So with that, most likely 1 team will be chosen. This team could be a winning team out of the 3 teams. It could be 3 teams being buddy-buddy and everybody coming together to form the final team. And that's where the remaining money of 20 million will be unlocked to fund the rest of the research. Now, the red portion is where things get interesting, because we would want to field test this in field environment, which means the hospitals itself. Which is why one of the blind men happens to be Ministry of Health, IHIS, which owns all the data. So it's one way of us looking at what government can play in the role of stimulating research, but bear in mind that we do have our own governance policies, or that how can we all cooperate together? So IHIS through MOH is supplying the data sets to help us. We will curate all the research talent. And we also work with national supercomputing clusters to provide all the computational needs that they want. So this is a snapshot of what long-term national grand challenge process that we have designed, at least for the first one. Second is AI research. So in AI research, we will invest in research vital to Singapore. Initially, when I had this deck, we were talking about the STEM side, the basic, the scientific side, there was actually a little piece about ethics, legal, and governance. But since the period when we were ramping up our program office, this has taken root quite a fair bit. So and so that SMU Faculty of Law now has spun off a dedicated research center just to look at the AI ethics and legal and governance side, right? So what AI research would do is to set out priority areas to invest and to fund fundamental research work. This is basically just a snapshot, but we divided into 2 phases because it's very difficult to crystal ball beyond 2 years. So for the first 2 years, this year and next year, we're focusing on machine learning technique that uses lesser and lesser data. There have been continual advancement to that, and that is actually quite synergistic to Singapore because we produce very little data as compared to places like China or in US as well. So machine learning techniques, that's very important. Second to the regulator is explainable AI. You need to develop AI neural net systems that can explain itself and reproducible system. Today, AI is becoming more and more like a black box, and it's very difficult for you to understand how AI arrive at different decisions. So that's one of the key areas. Now, NLP, natural language processing, CVs, these are basically natural things for us because Singapore is a diaspora. We have different cultures coming in together. So being able to interpret different languages at one go, that is pretty interesting for us, right? And so forth. These are basically just placeholder. And same thing here, we always like to put a white space because we don't know what we don't know, just to earmark funds for it, right? Now, 5 minutes left, I'll just quickly screen through this topic about industry innovation. So basically, industry innovation, we take a time and tested, trusted way of working with industry. We bring industry partners by curating the demand. We bring in the researchers by controlling the supply. Basically here what we want to do is to bring our researchers, the academic, the professors, to become sort of like a consultant. I mean, they teach, they do research work, but we also want them to become industry consultants. So 100 experiments is a way to bring them in as consultant. So what we do is we curate the problem for the industry, we reduce the search cost, we undertake the financial risk of the research work by funding the researchers, and then after 9 to 18 months, both sides walk away with joint IP. Joint IP is a new piece that we have added in because only with joint IP, it means both the company as the researchers own the foreground IP that's being created. Only with joint IP can we quickly scale the product out to the market. There are 2 modes that we work with for the industry. These are just processes. These are all available in our website. But essentially, what we want to do for the first step is to bring in the companies, bring the researchers. But we realized along the way that there's a shortage of AI engineers. So we work with one of the little blind men called IMDA, and they gave us additional funding to launch this new complementary program called AI Apprenticeship Program. It has since picked up pace, and it actually resulted in the few further slides that I'm going to show. Basically, we need AI engineers as much as we need AI professors, right? So we started to have people who are willing to come in, quit their jobs for 9 months, or they don't have any jobs to begin with. For 9 months, they come in with us. We actually put them as apprentice, and the deal is pretty sweet because they do get paid a stipend, quite a fair bit of stipend for the 9 months itself. So they get to work on the industry projects. That's just another scheme, way of looking at it. So first one, AI research, is where the research takes 18 months. The second one is where the research looks at 9 months. So we sort of arrive at this state where we will classify 2 types of AI project. It's either 9 months, very quick, fast turnaround, or 18 months that is slightly more. Anything more than 2 years, we don't do it because industry don't move at the pace of academia. So it must be less than 2 years. Now with the apprenticeship program, a little bit more is they go through 9 months, okay, 2 months of hybrid program. In fact, they still need to pass through an entrance exam. 2 months of hybrid learning, and then 7 months where they are put into each of the 100 experiment projects that we're doing anyway. The smart thing for the company to do is to hire these people, which has been working on the projects for free after they gone through the 100 experiment. Now, if the dumb company did not do it, I would have this apprenticeship going out to form startups. And these startups will be creating products that has already solved a real-world AI industry problem. So it's the pragmatism that I'm trying to convey to you, how we design the program itself. Now, what we realized then is a lot of people try to apply for AI apprenticeship, but because we are not in the business of teaching AI 101, so we actually screen out quite a fair bit of people, but we feel that if we're going to do it, if we're going to move the national needle when it comes to AI, even if you are not a person that's going to code in Python or R or that, you should also be versed in what is AI technique. Therefore, we then have AI for everyone. And then a sub-spin of that is AI for industry. So the program office keep evolving and evolving. Now, before I end my presentation, I keep talking about industry project. I'm going to end with a video. One of the outcomes of the 100 experiments. So it is one of the 100 experiments that we realized that there's actually quite a fair bit of companies and government agencies looking for this particular AI tool. So we have developed this for them.
我现在很 scared 嘞，有人在打抢 ，like there's someone like running away, like he's getting away. And right now, 有很多人在这边，很多人在 shouting 啦，可以快点来吗？啊，我在多巴尤那边，快点来。Everyone is quite. The scene here is very noisy.
Now we found out to our delight that two of our local research scientists are actually top NLP experts in the world. Their papers are widely cited. So basically what you see is a demonstration of possibly one of the world's first multi-language speech-to-text transcribing tool using AI. And as you can tell, those Singaporean here, Topayo, all that, those are detected and transcribed. So 3 government agencies and 1 private company is basically part of the beneficiaries of this. The program is already more or less coded. It's being refined into their business processes itself. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Singming. Our next speaker will come at this topic of technology's role in nation building from quite a different perspective. So Professor Volker Schmidt is Professor of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. His work focuses on social justice and inequality, social policy, social theory, and globalization. So speaking very much to that last role of government that I was talking about earlier. To talk to us about technology and its role in nations and society, please welcome Volker Schmidt. Thanks. Thanks.
Right, good afternoon. I should say in advance that I'm not very well versed in the technological side to this, and in fact this is the first time that I ever speak about it at all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a few ideas at you, food for thought, so to speak, right? Because given that I'm not a technological expert, right? I was wondering, I mean, you know, after I got the invitation to speak here, what could I possibly contribute? And so I came up with a few thoughts which one could say contextualize the debates around AI a little bit, and that's what I'm going to do. So is this to move the slides? No. Okay. So how do I get to the next slide here?
Just need to move this way.
This way, huh? Okay, so let's take a look at this chart here. Charts like this have been published at an increasing rates since since around the first decade of the new millennium. So one increasingly finds variations of this, right? And to me, that's a significant event, if you will, right? So what they do is they plot human socio-economic development over very long time periods of up to 10,000 years and extrapolate recent trends into the future, right? You can roughly see where we are now, right? According to these predictions. Okay, so what is the story they are telling, right? The story is that during most of human history, very little actually happened until one or more inflection points were reached, after which explosive, truly fundamental change sets in. Charts like these, graphs like these, are typically based on composite indexes that combine data on economic growth and GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, levels of educational attainment of the population, available scientific or non-scientific knowledge stocks, human life expectancy, and other relevant factors such as organizational capacity of states, Singapore being a very good one there, cities, businesses, infrastructures, and so on, various parameters. With the passage of time, the inflection points tend to be pushed forward, such that what was once viewed as a watershed development gets downgraded to a barely visible bump by later observers. Let me give you a couple of examples. First example I want to draw your attention to is the Industrial Revolution, starting around 1760, right? And it is portrayed by the contemporaries, or the ones, you know, with a little bit of temporal distance that people have when they begin to reflect upon this event, when they actually begin to call it an industrial revolution. It's portrayed as a landmark event ushering in the modern age, the second truly fundamental transformation in the history of humankind, the first one being the so-called Neolithic revolution, which turned us from hunters and gatherers into peasants largely. And so this is the next big thing, the Industrial Revolution. And one of the developments it includes is it sets in motion what economics call sustained economic growth, by which they mean permanent growth, permanent economic growth. Not every now and then a little bit, but permanent. And this has never happened in the history of humankind before, right? Okay. Contemporary observers were highly impressed. Among them were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who in 1948 wrote the 100 years leading up to the middle of the 19th century, that is the time they are writing, have brought about more fundamental change than all preceding history before. Okay? So this is not something small. They are really impressed, but we are not so impressed by what they saw anymore, right? So a couple later observers grant that yes, this may have been an important event, but, says Angus Maddison, an economic historian, economically speaking, the true transition to the new epoch really happens at least 50, if not 60, 70 years later. So sustained economic growth that is measurable sets in really only after 1820, right? Well, maybe, says Eric Hobsbawm, a well-known world historian, but even this exaggerates the impact of the changes observed in the 18th and 19th centuries, which pale in comparison to what the 20th century witnesses. For that century, especially during the period from 1950 to 1990, experienced, to quote, the greatest and most dramatic, rapid, and universal transformation in the history of humankind ever. Right? Maybe, and this is myself, but the worldwide change that has been happening in the less than 4 decades starting around 1980, the current wave of globalization, tops even that and amounts to what I have called the greatest and most dramatic transformation in human history. I have some data supporting this claim. Okay? But I won't bother you with that. So instead, what I want you to do is take a second look at my chart. No. Okay, I forgot this one. Sorry, I should have shown you that, but I basically told you the story. So this is my second look. The argument I want to make is that all of these observers, right, who are so impressed by what they are witnessing, they may all be right. Right? But in light of the latest data and evidence, what once appeared as an awe-provoking transformation is hardly noteworthy anymore. With growing temporal distance to the original event and the productive forces it unleashes, ever more unfolding their potentials, the significance attributed to the event decreases. Small bumps in a largely horizontal evolutionary curve. As it gets rewritten, history once again appears as a slow crawl, as Angus Madison calls it before 1820, right? 1820, a slow crawl. Until it begins to run, which is always in the present. This time, they tell us, and we tell ourselves, it's going to be different, truly different. Okay? And so you see, if you look at the Industrial Revolution there, right, it's actually roughly there, there's nothing, right? But it was a momentous change in the view of the contemporaries. Then, see, not much happens really until 1950, then it goes up a little bit, then it goes a lot more, and then it goes like this, and I've seen charts that continue to go like this, right? So in other words, human history is only just beginning. Human development is only just beginning, right? And what our ancestors have seen is really hardly worth noting, right? Okay? So this gives you a sense of what some people believe they have reason to expect from the future, for better or for worse, by the way. Okay, so what's important, and I mentioned this before, is charts such as this one, they predate the recent surge in attention devoted to technological developments in fields such as robots, AI, the Internet of Things, and the fears and hopes they nurture regarding the future of work, smart cities, surveillance, manipulation, cyborgology, posthumanism, you name it. This suggests the possibility that the latter might be symptoms of more fundamental driving forces rather than the ultimate causes of change. The predictions regarding the changes to come are made independently of the technological breakthroughs we are currently discussing. So, are the ultimate causes maybe to be sought in the social foundations of change, amongst which are typically mentioned innovation-spurring institutions such as markets, for instance, economic growth and prosperity, human empowerment by way of ever higher levels of education and things like that. Even if that were the case, technological breakthroughs ought still, of course, to be taken very seriously indeed, not least as they clearly do contribute to the overall picture and to setting the stage for even more radical change. Cutting-edge technological innovation helps spiral up technological change. Current technologies are the building blocks for their own next generation successors, which further accelerate the innovation process, for instance, by raising productivity, which then continues to accelerate at the next stage, and on and on and on it goes. So perhaps we too ain't seen nothing yet. If this is true, then we probably don't have an even remote preconception of what awaits us. All we can know is that the things to come will in all likelihood be very different from what we are accustomed to. This can lead to what I have elsewhere called disquieting uncertainty. Anxiety, stress, a sense of losing control. Okay, here's some good news. Assuming that some of the predictions about the future of work are correct. I mean, some projections suggest that in 15 years from now, half of all the jobs that we are currently engaged in will be gone, right? And the question is, what do we do? So the good news is that if the curves and the optimistic scenario that they project for future economic growth and aggregate wealth are broadly accurate, then we should be able to afford whatever it takes to deal humanely with the worst case fears regarding the future of work. The universal basic income that is currently under discussion can be financed. We will be rich enough, right? And the rich can still be rich. So they don't need to get nervous, as they may have reason to be if we make too many people useless. Okay. If we can find meaning in life beyond paid work and career, then our material future may look quite bright, provided we get our policies right. No more need for toiling to eke out a living, because machines will take over all dirty, dangerous, tedious, uninspiring work. In fact, the latest World Economic Forum report on the future of jobs predicts that by 2025, that's just around the corner, more tasks will be performed by machines than by humans for the first time in history. When we can read a book in the morning and go fishing in the afternoon, that's the way Marx describes his utopia of communist society, right? Okay, because the machines do all the work, right? So the question is, may we be witnessing the rise of a new leisure class? For the aristocracy, boredom was hardly an issue of great concern. So we might be able to cope and enjoy ourselves, spend our days mindfully and contentedly rather than amusing ourselves to death. Nonetheless, this alone would require very difficult adjustments because we are so obsessed with work. And it refers to just one of many manifold aspects of emerging changes whose scope nobody is aware of and can be fully cognizant of. It's simply too complex, too mind-boggling, and so forth. So maybe AI will help us navigate all the uncertainties. So that's the good news. And now a few notes on the bad news that may also be in the offing. The bad news, if any, is that the challenges we face in grappling with disruptive change may be far greater than what is currently anticipated based on what little we understand about the ongoing technological revolutions. We have to systematically expect the unexpected because what lies ahead of us may well exceed our imaginative and cognitive capacities. This also means history will be less valuable as a guide for the future, bad news for the epistemologically conservative. Change is multidimensional with many synergies across fields, but its precise nature and contours are impossible to predict with any degree of certainty. We have to adapt but lack a suitable compass for directing us. For example, what use is upgrading of human capital if any new skills are devalued by technological innovations before they can even be put to use? Still, doing nothing is not an option. The determinants of change are decentralized, distributed across many fields and locations around the world, ever more connected and cross-fertilizing each other, driven by multiple uncoordinated, partly complementary, partly antagonistic forces and interests. The change to come is very likely unstoppable, hard to steer, and will probably continue to accelerate. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
A big thank you to Volker Schmidt for, I think, setting the scene for the discussion that we'd like to welcome him back for. So if we could have all the speakers, if we could have Segmang back on the stage, Cheryl will sit down at the other end to co-chair our session. Volker, if you'd like to take a seat over
Thank
here.
you. Yes.
And if we can have Semenku back too. So we've got probably around 15 minutes to have a discussion about all of the issues that were raised in both of our first two provocations. Is this the right AI with Cho Fan Lee and Cheryl Chung? And are we building an AI nation? So before we kick off with some of the questions and thoughts that we might have, I want to open this up to the floor, maybe get some of the house lights up. So we can see you a little bit better, and ask if we've got questions or comments from the floor. Anyone want to ask any of our speakers questions? Well, we can start with a conversation here where you think of what your questions might be. Actually, there was a question that I wanted to pick up on your presentation, Seungmin. One of the things that you kind of mentioned in passing, which I found quite interesting, was data, and the data that Singapore owns, and the data that it would need to develop the kinds of sort of very strong, I guess, kind of solutions that you're looking at AI Singapore. You mentioned that, you know, the kind of data sets that the Singapore government, you know, has, around 6.5 million citizens, are really small in comparison to the data that it would need to develop the kinds of solutions that it's looking for. Can you maybe kind of speak a little bit more about what you mean by that, and also why it's significant?
Sure. Today, what you know as AI traditionally is two things that when people describe what AI is doing for them. One is actually machine learning, and a subset of machine learning is actually deep learning. So the techniques in deep learning require a lot of data to train. So what I mean by we have very little is more of you have very little data to train the model to a high degree of accuracy so that it actually makes sense for you to deploy in a practical state. Now, if you are in a situation where there's a lot of data, it makes it easy and makes it fast for you to train neural net models that will correctly predict the ground truth, and therefore you can deploy in live situation. But you have very little data. Basically, what you have is a neural net model that may not be that accurate. And when you deploy in a live situation, you may see a lot of false positives. So that's what I meant. And which is why one of the key research priorities is there are research into new advanced technique that require little and no data. The most famous is actually DeepMind. So DeepMind has its AlphaGo, which beat the Go player. So currently DeepMind has a new engine called AlphaZero. AlphaZero trains with no pre-data. So basically AlphaZero actually trains itself, and then at some point it rapidly overtakes AlphaGo. So that's what I mean.
That's great, thanks for that clarification. Questions or comments from the floor? Any of our code? We've got two over here. So have we got mic runners? Yep. Okay, Meg, I think we had Anya first, and then Shimon.
Hi. I was wondering, because you mentioned that the black box of AI, that you don't know what the results are, how the results are gotten at. So I heard that medical AI systems are really good for predicting people who have who will have schizophrenia, but they don't know how how the AI systems arrived at that. And I was wondering what this, you mentioned that there are techniques, or they're trying to figure out how the results were arrived at. So can't you just backtrack from the, I mean, I'm just wondering if you know the sort of process that they're trying to figure out how the AI system makes the decisions that it makes.
So going back then to the popular mode of what you perceive as AI, which is machine learning or deep learning, basically think of it as a way of programming a computer. So in the traditional way, let's take for example a cat. In the traditional way, you program it that it has 2 ears, 2 eyes, 1 nose, a mouth. But that could actually describe a dog as well as a human as well. So basically, it's very difficult for you to do traditional programming of what is a cat. So what machine learning does is feed it pictures of a cat, and what goes through the process is you actually adjust the neural net model in terms of hyperparameters and weight, so that the model, as you run through a new images, is sort of predict with a high accuracy that this is a cat. And if you train it then what looks like a dog, then you will then predict what looks like a dog. Back to your example. So when you talk about trying to analyze schizophrenic patients, what you need to do is to have a lot of background data, how to classify. So it's more like if you have good label data, the engine will be able to provide very good prediction. So I guess what I can emphasize here is AI is all about prediction. You are using a new novel way of programming computer so that the computer output actually has a high accuracy what it was trained on, so that the live examples mimic what you're training it to do. The problem right now is nobody knows how the parameters are being adjusted. And in the terms of JIJO, garbage in, garbage out, and in the terms of bias data, which is becoming quite a worry, is when you do training, when you input training data, some of the training data are actually human examples. Human decided to label that this is a bad patient or this is a good patient. The AI will just be trained on whatever is the human bias when it comes to the perception itself. So beside explainable AI, we are actually looking at reproducible AI, and there's even a new field that I didn't mention, which is called unbiased training, which means that you're supposed to reset itself every time it trains. So these are just some of the things that we find as you move AI into mainstream. The decisions that it's making is actually based on us, because we input the data.
That's a really important point. Cheryl, can you come in on this?
If I can just jump in a little bit. So I have this, so the first thing that came to my mind when you asked this question was, who watches the Watchmen? Right? So this kind of classic question in public policy. And I think it's a challenge, right? Because when you talk about false positives, I mean, it just is a word that rolls off your tongue. But in your schizophrenia example, that's basically somebody identifying me as potentially being schizophrenic when I'm not actually schizophrenic. And then where is the element of choice? Does that mean that I don't have, what's my recourse to querying into that decision? Who is able to correct that, even if I am able to solve my own false positive issue, who is able to query back into the process? So the public policy kind of side of me thinks, what's that responsibility, and where does that responsibility lie? Does it lie with the technologists? Does it lie with government? Does it lie with civic society? And I think those are the questions that we also have to wrestle with. Ultimately, who watches the Watchmen, right? Yeah.
Right, because it's either preventive or it's a policing thing.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
You are at risk or something like that. So if it's preventive, we can use it if we know how it arrived at to help people.
Exactly, and the line is so fine, huh?
Yeah.
I think we had a question over here from Shumon.
Yeah, it's a question to Volker, but it actually, in a sense, relates to the first presentation, which was from Cho Fan. So you weren't here, but Cho Fan, in a sense, set us up really perfectly for the next few days. And wittingly or unwittingly, your presentation bookended that beautifully with the two of you in the middle. But in a sense, Cho Fan sort of suggested or wanted to kind of postulate that the advent of AI is riddled with forms of anxiety and fear. But in truth, those anxieties and fears are in a psychoanalytical sense more to do with us than it is to do with the machine, right? So the machine, in some sense, is a kind of phantasmagoric, distorted projection of our own fears, and ultimately, if you end up creating something that can do all the things that you supposedly do, what makes you you, right? So, and therefore, this, I think, very, it's interesting that we use the word human as though it's self-evident. But my question to you, Volker, this wonderful graph that you showed, I was sort of wondering whether those kind of spike moments that you pulled out, or not you, but or historians have pulled out in a certain kind of economic historicizing of the past, where do those spikes also map onto crises of what it means to be human? Or would the graph of the crisis of what it means to be human actually be a very different graph to that? Because, I'm not going to answer the question. I have my suspicions, but I'd like to understand what you think as a sociologist.
Hard to say, but I mean, one of the observations that you make is that this development, which I have tried to depict, right, drawing on other people's work, is one that gets basically two types of comments throughout the history, right? One is, this is great. This is really fantastic, right? This puts human development on an upward trajectory, right? And I mean, for instance, if you factor in figures on what the World Bank calls absolute poverty, extreme poverty, right? By 1820, between 75% and 90% of the human population, we're about 1 billion back then, find themselves in extreme poverty. Now we're roughly down to 10%. In absolute terms, that's still a big number, but relatively speaking, given that we're now 7.5 billion, it's, okay, that's one of many aspects of a progress story you can tell. But at the same time, this development is also always accompanied by fears of loss, right? And the one thing that you certainly lose is your history, because, until very recently, the history was the present and the future, right? And that's over. It's basically over now. From one generation to the next, we live through completely different lives, if you will. New technologies, but referring to ever more dimensions of life. And for some people that is great, and for others it creates these kinds of anxieties. And there's of course also a literature that talks about dehumanizing, right? And of course, that's one of the fears associated with the current technological wave, gene technology, AI, and so forth. And some very dark scenarios are created around that. And I don't have an answer. I don't really have an answer, but what you can do sociologically is you can observe how these developments are looked at through very different prisms from different perspectives. And you can see that they create both opportunities, as the slogan goes, but also quite fundamental challenges, right? And then the impulse is often to say, okay, let the government do it, right? And my sense is that this is based on a rather simplistic understanding of society as well as the government, because the government can do only so much to control these developments. Even the most powerful government will not be able to control them because it has multiple driving forces. And so somehow we will have to make do, but how we will, who knows?
I just want to...
I think, sorry, just one more. The thing, that people like myself can do, I think, is only ask questions, right? The answers, they will have to come from a much bigger collective of people, you know, who can think, if you will, truly innovatively about how we can utilize, how we can harness technologies to our own benefit, rather than let them get out of control and things like that.
I suppose my brain is now ticking and wondering whether, you know, there's, again, if one were to kind of sort of overlay the graph that you showed, whether one could say, you know, what's bad for the human is good for business. And so whether, and here I'm thinking, of course, of, you know, the history of slavery and its role in terms of globalization. I'm thinking of the advent of kind of machinification during the Industrial Revolution and the kind of production of a sort of man-machine, right? So, and at each of these stages of what we might call, you know, a kind of history of so-called dehumanization are actually the kind of quantum leaps of global economic activity. I mean, that's a new idea to me, which your presentation kind of puts forward, I'm just thinking, is it?
But I guess it's also ambivalent there, right? When you talk about business, of course, I mean, there are predatory businesses, obviously. But at the same time, I mean, you know, if you look at someone like Marx again, right? He was very concerned about predatory businesses, if you will, right? But at the same time, the one thing he admired capitalism for is that it enabled us, humanity, to leave behind the worst forms of poverty. Before that, that was simply not an option, right? And so that can also be viewed, even though you have to go through all the sweatshops and all this stuff, right? That can also be viewed as humanizing, right? And the interesting thing is that you do not tend to get one without the other.
What a provocative thought. And I think this is something that our next speaker after our break, Ellie, will be picking up from directly and quite eerily kind of presaging our next discussion. We've got time for just one more question in this panel here. If anyone has any last questions before our short 15-minute break. Otherwise, we will be back for more discussions. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of wrapping up notes, actually, because they're going to relate to discussions that we're going to be having over the next couple of days. We heard in Seng-Meng Ku's presentation the possible uses of artificial intelligence for medical care. This is a topic that we're going to be going into in quite some detail tomorrow, specifically looking at some of Singapore's AI innovations within medical care. As we've heard in Volker's wonderful provocation, perhaps some of the kind of anxieties that we feel and some of the hopes that we feel about artificial intelligence, big data, and automation might not be new, and we could look to history perhaps, kind of for guides about how we might, kind of call the hype, kind of on our current moment and approach it with a little bit more mindfulness. I think looking at the kind of the sort of the ethical decisions that are made within artificial intelligence and big data is going to be something that we pick up very squarely in our data session tomorrow with Sarah Watson and Wesley Goatley. So I thank our speakers sincerely because either deliberately, kind of, or wonderfully serendipitously, they've actually set up some quite major conversations that we're going to be having for the next 2 days. So please join me in welcome and rather thanking all of our speakers from the first 2 sessions, and then we'll break shortly for 50 minutes.
Hi, I think we're going to start, please. Thank you very much. My name is Shun Masa. I'm the Commissioner of the Global Art Forum. If you were here earlier, I think you will recognize that some of the issues that have been brought up from our previous speakers will now be continued to be kind of analyzed and investigated by our 2 guests. I'm going to be hosting both of them, and they're both friends of the Global Art Forum, and so I'm very, very happy that they've accepted our invitation to come back and continue to share their thoughts with us in this, for us, certainly a new context. So this session, first session of the last stretch of the afternoon is called I Make Value, Automated Markets and the Future. It's said that up to 90% of trades on financial markets are now conducted by automated algorithmic processes, operating at speeds exponentially faster than that of human traders. But I think what Ellie will be suggesting is, what does a statement like that really mean? And whether a statement like that is actually indeed true. Also, what kind of philosophy does an accelerated, automated market system produce? And if the market is as massive as history itself, which is a phrase that Ellie has used, what can we predict about the history of tomorrow? Elie Ayash was trained as an engineer at l'École Polytechnique of Paris. He pursued a career of option market maker on the floor of Matif and Lif, and then turned to the philosophy of probability, where he studied at the Sorbonne, and to the technology of derivative pricing, and co-founded ITO 33, a financial software company, in 1999. He's the author of 2 super interesting books. I recommend them both, Blank Swan and The Medium of Contingency. And Ellie joined us at the Global Art Forum a couple of years ago, which was, the edition was called The Future Was. And we were looking at, we were attempting to look at looking back to understand how the future had been predicted, visualized, prophesized, and whether those sort of predictions had really manifested the way that we thought they might. And Ellie was invited to talk about the way in which time, and particularly extremely fine, almost nanoscale of time, is encoded in the financial markets and markets made of derivatives and these sort of recent phenomena of financial instruments. So Ellie's going to give a presentation, and then I'm going to be following up with a conversation immediately after. So will you please join me in welcoming Elie Ayash? Thank you very much.
Be back and to talk again in front of such a diversified and interesting audience, at least diversified from my point of view, because I come from finance and from a very boring life of trading. Well, as you mentioned, I used to be a market maker myself of options on the trading pits, and I have corrected the title. It's not I make value, it's I make price. It's because I make a distinction between price and value, and basically my talk is going to show you the massive difference that there is between value as it is the output of some algorithm or calculation, and price as it's given by the market. So I could stand here and talk to you for an hour about how fast the trading algorithms have become and how they compete in the nanosecond down to the millions of cents, but I don't find that very philosophically interesting. Actually, there is no mathematical finance. There is no finance, actually, in algorithmic trading, and I like finance and mathematics, so I will take a step back and rather talk about the philosophy of automation itself and the philosophy of the market, in the hope that the two will illuminate each other, and you will see there is a very deep link between the market and automation. So I'll be critical of both in this discussion. So the market, the financial market, falls in a very special category with regard to automation, because at first you may have the impression that it is among the earliest cases of automation and actually the most accomplished ones, because the financial market has abstracted the real economy, as we say, and it's made up solely of numbers and random generators of numbers. So you may think that it will lend itself very easily to automation, because all you have to do is do statistics and let the algorithm guess from statistics how the numbers will behave. So that's the temptation, and this is what Schumann suggested at first when he said 90% of everything is done by algorithmic trading, whereas I say I don't really care about that. It's not very interesting, because I will argue, my thesis will be that the market cannot be the object of automation. Maybe parts of the market can be subjected to automation, but the market as such, if you think about it philosophically, belongs in the infrastructure of the notion of automation. And by that I mean that if you think philosophically about automation, about being a structure or an architecture of some algorithm, the market belongs in the criticism of that, what I call the infrastructure of that, meaning what is it to automate something, what is automation, a criticism of automation. As a matter of fact, in the archaeology of abstract thought, I will argue that the market is earlier than the notion of automation itself. It's even earlier than the notion of number. And here I would refer to people who argue that actually abstraction and mathematical abstraction, who the Greek more or less invented in ancient Greeks, was the result of the invention of money before that. So money was the real abstraction that first inspired mathematical thought. So the market is earlier than even the notion of mathematical number. So I will argue then that the market is a different category than algorithmic automation, algorithmic in the sense, the ordinary sense that everybody is thinking about, and I will deploy 3 lines of arguing to argue this. The first one will come from the superstructure, and actually from a very unusual line of thinking as regards myself, which is Marxian criticism, which I have discovered recently, as I will tell you. And it will argue that capitalism itself is a machine. So capitalism itself, of which the financial market is only the quantitative device, if it's itself a machine and an automat, surely we must be talking about a different meaning of automation in that large sense than automation in the sense of algorithms. So I will discuss that. Second, I will speak about algorithmic trading and the accomplishment of all this, which is the derivatives market, and try even from this very technical point, extract a direct criticism of algorithmic trading. So that's the part where I'm an expert. And finally, if we have time, or maybe we can leave that to do discussion, because I said that the market belongs in the infrastructure of automation, I will have to maybe discuss what this infrastructure is. So genesis of the notion of number, of value of a variable, and of the state that a machine or an automated system is said to be in. This if we have time. And my conclusion, my general conclusion will be that price is not a number when you understand by number the value that is output by an algorithm. Price is made up differently. The genesis of price is different from the genesis of an output, even though it may seem on the surface of things that price is a numerical value, of course, but if you think about the genesis of it, it's made up differently, I argue, than how the input-outputs of algorithms are made or have to be thought about. So first of all, automation and capital. Of course, to be critical of automation and of capital, you may expect that this line of criticism will come from the left wing, I mean from philosophers who are well learned in Marx, and I will show that this is the case. So what do they have to say? I was very happy to receive Schumann's invitation because in the summer actually, because I was absorbed in reading this French philosopher. The book was published a few months ago, not yet translated to English, unfortunately. Jean Vulac, who is a contemporary young philosopher, and precisely this very thick book in which I was absorbed. What is a criticism of capitalism at the light of technology? And it's in this book that I learned how I, as a philosopher, should be reading Marx, really, and I will tell you more about it. And it's in this book that Vulac will establish the equation between capitalism and machine, as I said. The book is interesting because even though he's a political philosopher, he's actually very versed in the philosophy of science. So he begins with an analysis of quantum mechanics, actually, and he argued there that quantum mechanics has already exceeded human intelligence. Nobody understands quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics, according to him, is already a case of artificial intelligence because you can only make sense of it in the laboratories where you have abstract numbers and instruments of measurement that are making sense of it. And if I want to translate the title, Approche de la criticité, it would translate into approach of criticality. And if you look criticality, what it means the conditions under which a nuclear chain reaction is able to continue by itself. So this already is a reference to automation in a sense, and of course to the danger of it. So Vulac deploys the following argument. He puts himself in the steps of Husserl and Heidegger, and he argues basically that Marx should be reread at the light of Husserl and Heidegger. Why these two philosophers? Because Husserl is known in his major work, The Crisis of European Sciences, to have provided a critique of scientific rationality. He argues that the origin of Greek rationality, the one which leads to modern science, to mathematical ideality, and we can say today's computer science, this origin lies in thought being forgetful of the earthly, carnal, and subjective conditions of human life and of the life world. So there is a detachment that the Greek have accomplished by the abstraction. And Heidegger also continues this by saying that it's not true that thought is presented at first with abstract object. The first thing that gives itself to mind are tools, meaning concrete relations that man has with the earth and with the world. So therefore, according to this line of philosophizing, the European sciences, as we know them today, of which computer science is a child, are already an abstraction, a detachment from the concrete world and the concrete conditions. So science is already automatic in a sense. And Vulac says that we should read Marx at the light of this criticism. So think of Marx not as the Marxist Marx, but as the Marxian Marx, the philosopher, the ontologist. So Marx is more or less saying the same thing according to him, because he's basically saying that behind contemplative theory, metaphysics, and abstract being, there is the ontology of concrete production and work. So according to Marx, nothing is autonomous, nothing is by itself, everything is actually produced concretely. So now to capitalism. Now the abstraction of capitalism, according to this reasoning, consists in forgetting the earth and the presupposition of work. So capitalism is an abstraction of that. And of course, capitalism then can be seen as the going all the way. It's the accomplishment of metaphysics as has been originated by the Greek, and the accomplishment of the Greek logos. By reducing work power to an abstract quantity, capitalism is a cybernetic unframing. The word enframing is a word by Heidegger, actually, which he has used while writing about technology, and he wrote that in the 1950s, and that was the dawn of the computer age, as you know, because 1948 is cybernetics by Norbert Wiener, 1946 is the invention of the computer by John von Neumann. And there's this fantastic argument, fascinating argument, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is the invention of money. Because in Vulac he develops it also, and the argument was first proposed by Son Rettel in 1976. So it's not, as Kant have thought, that actually abstraction comes to mind spontaneously or is generated by the faculties of the mind. Number, mathematics, theoretical objects, the whole genesis of ideality is secretly related to the appearance of money and exchange in ancient Greece. So the idea here is to say that abstraction cannot be inspired spontaneously to the human mind. It came from reality, and actually it's the exchange and money that inspired abstraction, because as you exchange an object with somebody else, when the object leaves your hands to go in a trip into space to land in the hands of somebody else, in that trip the object has to become ideal, and in a sense no longer to move or get altered anymore in space or time, hence the idea of abstraction. And Son Rettel and Vulac after him developed the whole argument that the whole of abstraction could be actually a consequence of the preliminary invention of money in ancient Greece. I find that this is very interesting, because I will then comment that if money is the material operator of abstraction, then money itself is not abstract, it's something else, because it leads to abstraction. So it's, again, in the infrastructure of abstraction. Word about cybernetics. So as cybernetic control, capitalism is more general than particular ideology, because actually both the two blocks, the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, have been using machines. So according to Vulac, both of them are capitalist in the sense of abstraction. So, but in one case, the case of the East, communism, cybernetic control is accomplished by the state. In the other case, our case, neoliberalism, it's accomplished by the market. So the common point between the two is this, because either the state or the market are in the end only two different modes of domination of an abstract entity. The state is abstract and the market is abstract. So in the end, the abstraction is the real culprit. So abstraction is what is taking us away of life, away of man, of the earth, and to the machine. So now I'll move to my second part, algorithmic trading and financial derivatives. So all of this can sound very abstract to you, so I'll try to make it now more fieldwork and more realistic by talking about my expertise. I said algorithmic trading is not very interesting because, of course, by trading algorithms, I'm not interested in algorithms that do order splitting or that do scalping, meaning that trade in the nanosecond. That could be interesting in algorithms are the predictive algorithms, the ones that try to actually predict the behavior of the prices. Their major assumption, and here lies the abstraction, is that behind the prices that you observe empirically in the market, there abstractly exists a random generator of numbers, of prices, which the algorithms try to learn from historical data. And once they got that model, they then try to predict the next price. Will it be lower or higher than the present price? And in this way, given the assumption of the model that they have, they establish an automated trading strategy trying to make money. And this picture here, I'm sure it is familiar to many of you. It looks very realistic. I mean, this says it all. This is algorithmic trading is all already contained in this. This is a picture of Brownian motion, which is the simplest stochastic model that we use in finance. It was discovered by Bachelier in 1900, but made rigorous mathematically by Wiener, the same Wiener as the cybernetics in 1920s. And here, even though it is realistic, there is a lot of structure in this image because it's only down to one number. So if you think about the markets, and if you think that the markets have to be random, and there couldn't be any time scale at which you could predict the price, otherwise you will make money for free. Already Bachelier has had this intuition. You end up with the notion that it should be random at any scale, and you get the notion of volatility, that number. And that number volatility gives you the whole graph already. So it is realistic, but it's actually very structured, very constrained. And if you look at that, I mean, of course, if you feed the algorithm with that number volatility, it becomes only a matter of computation to try to guess at different time horizons with what probability that the stock price will exceed certain levels or get below certain levels. You just apply a probability, and then you imagine that the trading algorithm will try to trade against that if the stock deviates a lot and above its mean, for instance, then it will have to go back, etc. So in that already you have the essence, if you will, of algorithmic trading, until in 1973, an unexpected result was shown by Black-Scholes and Merton, and they earned the Nobel Prize for that. And the result, which is actually at the very foundation of my business, is that Black-Scholes and Merton have shown that an algorithmic trading strategy in some asset is equivalent to assigning a value to a derivative written on it. So it's funny because from the abstraction of the algorithm, they have shown that this is equivalent to assigning a value to something which is a derivative, which is a new product, and therefore you can go ahead and no longer leave that value in the machine, but you will be tempted, and this is what happened from 1973, now that you have the algorithm to produce the value of that derivative, to actually write that instrument, to write new derivatives, produce new financial instruments which are the derivatives, and then you are tempted to trade them not in the machine but in the market. And it's here that the criticism will come, because if you trade them in the market, it means that by definition the market will take them away of the prediction of the algorithm. Why should there be a market if the value is going to be given by the algorithm? Keeping in mind that now that you have the algorithm, your first temptation is to trade them in the market. So that's my point, whereby the market is going to exceed any algorithm. And by the way, the market crash of 19 October 87 marked the failure of the value assigning algorithm of Black and Scholes. And in my sense, it was the real birth of options market and more generally derivatives market at that moment. Why? Because the prices of derivatives should not be the result of algorithmic computation. They are not values, as I said, given by an algorithm. They are not outputs. They can only be given independently by the market. So you may be tempted at that point to enhance the algorithm and to say, instead of modeling just the algorithmic behavior of the stock and have the derivative be priced algorithmically of that, why don't I model both as given by the market? You can't, because the argument translates to the next level. Even if we assumed a random generator of derivative prices, the problem carries over to derivatives written on those derivatives. The conclusion, the market, the way I understand it, means inclusive of all layers of derivative, cannot be automated. The market doesn't compute. It is made up of a different structure than the structure of input, output, and algorithm. Thank you. And here are two pictures of what the reality of the derivatives market is. According to the algorithm, there should be a flat surface, whereas here it's a picture of last week of the Euro stocks. You have 1,000 option trading here. Each one of them is trading independently of its neighbor at a different volatility level. Thanks. Shall I join you here?
Please, yeah. Thanks so much, Ellie. We will open it up. So if you want to start percolating questions, please do, and I'll open it up in the next few minutes. But I certainly have a few things I wanted to ask Ellie. The first is biographical. I think what struck me when I first came across your work was I don't know many people that worked in the financial trading market who then decided to become philosophers.
It wasn't a decision, it was like it was imposed on me somehow.
So can you tell us more about this in my opinion, quite unusual arc, and the fact that you're, in a sense, still, now it's not that you erased your previous files and replaced them with being a full-time philosopher. You're still working within the financial sector.
Sure.
So can you talk us through how that journey happened?
Already, finance is not physics, therefore it is metaphysics, because it's not real. You keep listening arguments that finance is not real. Is money real? Is anything real in finance? Already, those are metaphysical questions. All right, so that's a general comment.
But it's that. Because this one of my favorite phrases from Ellie's work is the metaphysics of the market,
yes,
which I'd never heard of before. And I heard that, and that did something to my brain. And it's still, because actually, because so many of us are told, even despite flash crashes and 1987 and so on and so forth, that in a sense the market is a kind of is somehow a rational system, even if it behaves irrationally. That it is, it's a kind of manifestation of all that is, the kind of most rational interests of humankind. But you then introduced the idea that it's actually metaphysical. Was this your discovery and kind of proposition, or is this something that has existed already in the past?
From my talk, if you understand by the market, and not all philosophers are aware of this fact, I mean the professional philosophers, if you will, if you understand by the market what I said you should understand, meaning the market plus all the derivatives, then the market becomes a direct criticism of the metaphysics of probability theory and the metaphysics of algorithms. So therefore, if the market is a criticism itself, so the market is philosophy itself. It's not the philosophy of the market. The market itself is philosophy, according to me. And anyone who is interested in the philosophy of probability, and of course, when you take a course in metaphysics, you have to you learn about what's probability, possibility, contingency, necessity. These are the keywords of metaphysics. And in the market, you will find exactly the most advanced stage of what happens to these things, which again I argue, that's why I wrote 2 books, exceeds the received view. Exceeds the received view. Now, what triggered personally, biographically, my interest in that was from my first day on the market, which happened to be 19th of October, 87. The market crashed.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, because I was hired by the bank in September, and that day, because in Friday, there was like a trade balance figure that was released, and my boss told me, why don't you go on the floor because it's something interesting might happen. So I went there and the crash happened. And I went back to the office and said, well, it was very interesting. And I was under the impression that it would be like this every day, because that was my first day. So from the beginning, I started out in the opposite view of, you know, the smooth graphs, etc. I started, I like to say, my way right into the pit, in the sense of the bottomless pit, of what's at the bottom of this nothing, actually. And from the start, I was impressed by the fact that there was no way you can code in a machine what happened that day. Because that was the pure event which later, when I started learning, studying Deleuze, Badiou, and Meillassoux, I started putting in a more philosophically established background. Not to mention Nassim Taleb, who I was friends with from those days, who, of course, wrote The Black Swan, without reading Badiou himself or reading Bergson, but he's more or less developing the same ideas, meaning his definition of the event is basically what's always outside the box. Whatever prediction or scenario algorithm that you have, the event by definition is something that will exceed those, if only the failure of the algorithm. So the first event that can happen to an algorithm is its failure. And this is what I illustrated when I said that if you devised any algorithm in finance, there must exist a derivative that you could write that will, when it trades, contradict the algorithm. You see how all of this thinking is very logical, because we are talking about also about self-reference, about a system, the market, which again cannot be, is not computable even in the mathematical sense. And why it's not a surprise, because the market is real. I say it's not abstract. Why it's real? Because it's equivalent, you said, it's as massive as history. If you think as history, meaning the history that we are living every day and in which massive events keep happening, if you think of it as a movie, I would like to think of the financial market as the soundtrack of that. Of course, it's quantitative, so it's only numbers, but numbers can be far more richer than algorithms. So of course, all of this is metaphysics. I mean, do you agree?
And I'm curious, so this figure gets, you know, put about at the, this kind of 90% of the market is,
unfortunately,
is automated. If we go back to your first day on the market, 1st of October 1987, the Black Monday, as it were, how much of the market was automated at that point?
I mean, nothing. There wasn't. In those days, there was program trading, which was inherited by the Black-Scholes theory, meaning Black-Scholes told the investors how to automatically hedge a certain portfolio that you have, which was in effect as if you bought protection for your portfolio. So buying, instead of going to an insurer and tell an insurer to insure your holdings in some stock, Black and Scholes showed the investors how to themselves, to let the algorithm, I mean the computers themselves, perform progressive selling of the stocks as the market collapsed. And because all of the algorithms sold the market at the same time, this precipitated the crash. So the first case of algorithm were actually program trading to protect portfolio. It wasn't speculative as it is today. It wasn't as today because you need the technology that you have today in order to trade in the nanosecond. So no, not even the markets themselves were automated, because I used to be a market maker, blood and flesh on the floor. And I do believe that even though today, I mean, you can automate that because you now have trader clicking on the mouse instead of physically going in the open outcry. So even if in that sense the ultimate decision is in the hands of the trader, I still believe that a lot was lost, because to be humanly present in that place gives you other feelings than being behind the screen. And this, of course, cannot be automated.
Because actually that space, you know, the kind of bear pit of stock exchanges, you know, I think is one of the kind of very iconic defining spaces, certainly of post-war capitalism, right? And you know, I can think of many movies,
sure,
whether it's Wall Street or you know, various other things, or indeed Andreas Gursky's great series of these kind of stock exchanges. And you know, so but what is the equivalent of Andreas Gursky's picture of, you know, of the traders, of the trade hall, you know, in this kind of, which there's something ancient, gladiatorial, yes, physical, of course, very masculine, male, demonstration of power. You know, what's the equivalent? What if Andreas Gursky was trying to take a photograph of the contemporary version of that? What would that photograph look like today?
I mean, I think there's no equivalent because the pits, the feeling that you have there, it's unique. I mean, I like to call it. You find yourself in the heart, in the bottom of the event itself. And by the way, I mean, there are a lot of books, and one of them has this picture as a cover that have investigated the sociology of trading pits and talking exactly what you said about, you know, struggle for power between men and women sometimes. So, I mean, I do believe that actually when it becomes a matter of, because those pits are bottomless, so surely in a crash, for instance, no one can say what is the bottom price except a human being. So I myself would argue that when you are faced with a dramatic situation like the crash, which by itself is already worth the whole thing. So if crashes should happen once every 5 years and be critical of the whole thing, it's enough to throw the whole thing away because, but in a crash where nobody has no clue, certainly the algorithm would have no clue what price to show, and only, according to me, somebody who is there, who's observing what's going on, the other players, could produce a price. So, I mean, no, the markets are made by human beings. Even if 90% is algorithmic trading today, this is unfortunate because the whole, for instance, industry of derivatives, because it's complex and it requires some math, which is beyond just, you know, trading in the next tick. A lot of people in the banks have abandoned that field to all rush in high-frequency trading and the rest. But I think it's unfortunate. There is no way, because as I said, derivatives should be here, that you can automate the whole market and leave it to machines. No, I mean, market maker to me, even if you are clicking on a mouse or even if you are making the execution automated, the ultimate decision cannot be left to a machine.
And then I want to ask you, what, in your opinion, what would have been the, you know, the presiding motive behind the automation and the I mean, as you just said yourself, the bear pit doesn't exist anymore. So at the very least, these people have been put out of that work.
Except in some places, like in Chicago, there was, yes.
But, you know, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, or indeed, you know, these kind of like captivating but also queasy images of Alibaba, you know, service warehouses, which are often kind of fully roboticized, this kind of strange ballet of robots moving things so that we get them.
We all want speed, yes.
You know, so those things were, the motives were quite simple, right? Like radical efficiency, increased productivity, and ultimately increased profit motive. Was that the same thing driving the automobile,
yeah, I mean, speed.
Or something else?
You want the order executed better and quicker than your opponent. Even if you know that there are market orders that are being put to the market, you can argue that if you are quicker than the actual algorithm of the clearinghouse itself that is going to put the order maybe you can take that extra tick, and you have people who develop exactly this, which is taking advantage of the microstructure of the market. I mean, of course, as long as you can earn a million of a cent, but you can do a million trade to earn it, you will do it. I mean, there is no way you can stop technology. But as I said, this is not interesting because, I mean, there's nothing about it which is metaphysical, and it's not the market. According to me, it's just like a current situation that we are in, but this will not dispense with derivatives. Derivatives are essential because only with the market completed with derivatives can the market be a technology of the future, and could the market encode something which is impossible, which is the memory of the future. A machine cannot do it. Again, I mean, you can be happy by thinking that the market is a machine, of course, but then it's not an algorithmic machine, it's something else.
But that then goes back, perhaps my last question before I open up, this idea that capitalism is a kind of automated machine, right?
That's not my idea.
It's not your idea, but we were discussing this and so you know, if that's the case, then it's not surprising we would have a lust for many other machines to propagate, you know, because that's like the master order. Anyway, are there any questions from Noah at the front? Can we get a microphone here, and then the third row? Microphone, please.
Thank you very much. I guess I have a simple question around the implications of your argument. If I understand it correctly, essentially, you're saying that the market is essentially stochastic or semi-random. You can measure that, but as soon as you measure that and reintroduce it to the market, it becomes increasingly random and your algorithm fails, and ad infinitum, kind of Gödel's incompleteness theorem kind of thing.
Yes.
So I guess my question then is what's the implication? I mean, is it sort of, as Taleb says, that people who rely on these sorts of predicted algorithms are chumps?
Yes.
Or towards Schumann's larger point, if we as a civilization have this approach to this essential element to our modern industrial civilization, you know, are we all chumps and therefore running towards the inevitable, you know, explosion of this fundamental infrastructure of our society?
No, my argument is actually optimistic. I'm saying that even in the field where you would think that algorithmic trading would do its best, meaning the financial market, I can produce an argument against automation. So what could it be then in the case of big data and modeling the behavior of human beings? It's much worse. So my argument is to say that even in the case where you think it would be ideal prey for artificial intelligence, it's not the case because of derivatives. People, again, are not aware of derivatives. People who are thinking about this, even the philosophers like Dulac, are not aware of that fact that, so it's not sequentially then the derivative of next generation will defeat the algorithm of the previous generation. Of course, this is what happens in practice, but you should think of the derivatives happening at the same time.
If you generalize that into a big data society, sort of hypothetical AI-driven, you know, governance, even in the most advanced and sophisticated mechanism of control or surveillance or prediction, there's still room for freedom.
Yes, of course. I mean, maybe they will automate, definitely things can be automated, but you will not automate the whole market. So, well, I mean, it's not a new argument. I mean, Popper has, for instance, written about an algorithm cannot self-predict. So the failure of the algorithm cannot be predicted by the algorithm. So if any algorithm can fail, that's it. You will be outside the algorithm.
Over here, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My brain's just exploding right now. But
is that a good thing?
Yes. In your opinion, as a Marxist philosopher, would you posit that the
now you're a Marxist philosopher.
As a Marxist philosopher and trader, and would you posit that the conceptualizations and abstractions of automation is our fetishism for the future in the classic Marxist theory of fetishism, much like the 1800s Spanish fetishism of gold or the German fetishism of wood as cultural identity? And additions and associations of how we value this stuff. If yes, but for us in this generation right now, there seems to be a paranoia and suspicion for our fetish object instead of just lust and primordial passion. You know, your thoughts on that? Thank you.
First of all, I'm not a Marxist philosopher.
philosopher, you know.
Yeah, now I'm a Marxian reader because thanks to Dulac, I read him recently. But of course, I was fascinated. I sketched Dulac, but I was fascinated by exactly what he was saying. I had a slide on this, the fetishism of value. According to him, capitalism is the self-valorization of values. So there is a fetishism of valuation in capitalism. That's how he defined capitalism. And I agree with you that there is now a fetishism of, you know, automation and all that. So agreed. But then the question about what's next? I mean, what could our next fetish be? I, for one, I'm very happy because if I go back to the previous talk, now in the afternoon I'm reading Marx itself, so I have something to do, a new value to look at. I mean, we shouldn't really worry. I mean, 100 years ago we might have worried that cars would take over, or trains would take over, or planes would take over, which they have in a sense, but not really. I mean, we are still. Somebody will still make the decision, somebody will still do the programming. So again, don't worry, even the market will defeat the fetishism of value ultimately.
Thank you. We'd have time for one more question, then we keep moving on. Over there, gentleman, please. Thank you.
Hi. So you make a big jump from Greek philosophers to Marx and Husserl and Heidegger. I think there is a kind of landmark in the middle which could be interesting to consider, which is the birth of combinatorics with Raymond Lull, Leibniz, and Giordano Bruno, where somehow these people start to move from the reality, not really reality, but real things and real concept philosophy to abstract objects like letters or something else, do operations on the abstract things, and then reconcretize in the philosophical or metaphysical domain. So somehow it seems to me that it's a bit the same kind of things which is happening with the market, with now going to a system of abstraction where you apply abstract operations on the abstract objects for a while, for some combinatorics series of operations, and then go back to the reality, or not really reality, but something like more the price and value system.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the whole technology that black holes have developed served only one purpose: is to have us trade the options on the real pits, not in the machine. So
yeah,
we have to go back to reality, of course, and to trade.
But what I want to say is that I think the real, point of no return is not really the move from the real things to the abstraction, but the fact that in the abstract domain, you start to apply operation without referring to the meaning of the abstract object. Okay. This makes it possible to do new operations that you would not have imagined if you just have stick with the real things. If you understand more or less. Okay.
So the question is if this happening in the market.
Yeah. If this kind of similar things happening in the market now with the move from the real market to the derivative market.
No, I mean, a derivative contract will expire someday, so the day it will expire is the real day. Money is real, according to me, not abstract. So in the end, if a derivative is going to provide a material payoff, so it's real. Again, I mean, if you look in the minds of the algorithms who are trading the data, of course, there's some structure, there's some abstraction, no doubt. But
I have to kind of wrap this up, but I think the phrase, the mind of the algorithm, is a kind of quite beautiful way to finish this session. So before I introduce our next guest, Ellie, do you have to catch a plane? Or are you
no, I'm good.
He was previously going to literally run out of the door straight into a taxi onto the airplane, but Ellie will be staying with us this evening. So I'm sure some of you will have other questions, and perhaps you could pose those to Ellie outside or around this evening. But for now, will you please join me in thanking Ellie for a fantastically provocative and interesting conversation. I'm now going to introduce our next guest, Jess Bland, and the session is called Am I Still Employed? Jobs, Joys, and What Do You Do? So for hundreds of years, new ways of technology have motivated fresh fears of automation of human labor. Some of this fear has been about loss of jobs, but that is wound together with worries about loss of personal identity. Okay. We now develop machines that can take on tasks deeply woven into our human identities, producing knowledge, decisions, and perhaps even, as Cho-Fan suggested, some kind of intelligence. So what kind of social order would remain in a world without economic status or knowledge work as hierarchy? Jess Bland is head of research at the Dubai Future Foundation and previously head of technology futures team at Nesta, which is a UK foundation. She works on the governance of emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, and open science. And she's worked at the Royal Society and written for The Guardian and The Economist. We were lucky enough to have Jess also present at the Global Art Forum in Dubai. And it seemed to me very important that we invited her again because, as I suggested in my introduction earlier today, of the kind of close monitoring of the UAE and Singapore, and particularly in relation to national AI policies. So will you please join me in welcoming Jess Bland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. the subject of employment is funnily linked to the last talk. I'm actually the daughter of a futures trader. And I have this weird experience sometimes when people say, oh, you work in futures. In my world, that's futures and foresight policy in government. But people quite often think I do what my dad did, which is not really the same thing at all. Metaphysically, I'm not sure what that says, but something does. So what part of the work that we do at the Dubai Future Foundation is on behalf of the Dubai government and increasingly the UAE government. We think about the interactions between politics and technology, particularly in areas where new policy needs to be made or there's a kind of urgency for work to be done. And one of the headlines around automation that we hear a lot of is around the loss of labor, or the loss of jobs, really. The labor is still there. And in fact, we often hear the headline that 47% or 50% of jobs will be lost to automation. Lots of nodding, good. You heard the same thing I have. And this goes alongside fears around algorithms going wild in the world and ruining our lives, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I care about today is slightly demystifying that headline that we hear frequently, trying to pull apart the fatalism of the idea that robots will take your job, and then go through 3 ways that we can creatively perhaps have some more agency in dealing with automation technologies in a way that augments the way we work, perhaps betters the way we work, perhaps gives us new kinds of jobs, instead of focusing entirely on how we deal with unemployment. And I think this is a really nice way of looking at it, particularly in Gulf economies, where we have a very monitored labor force, where jobs are carefully created, and in Singapore as well, where there's a highly skilled population. Many of us have the freedom within our labor, within our knowledge work, to actually choose the tasks we do in a day in these markets. And that's probably the best place to start when we think about those who have the agency in the space, to think about how they work with automation technologies, as opposed to others who have those thrust upon them and probably have a lot less space to play with. So I've called this kind of a secondary title, Can Creativity Kill the Algorithmic Star? And that's because I want to talk about 3 ways that creative practice can give us this greater agency. Firstly, in greater imagining for what you can do in a day, so each of us as an agent. Secondly, in how we can better design systems, particularly political systems, for that leadership decision-making when it comes to giving everyone more agency. And finally, when it comes to communication and how we better share what we really mean by an automation technology or an algorithm, so more people around the world have the space to decide what they do. But first to the slightly pulling apart the idea that robots will take our job. And some of this is really well covered earlier today, so I'm going to go through it quite quickly. But this is one of my favorite newspaper headlines from 1928, in the middle of the Great Depression, beginning of it in America. A time of great inequality in the labor market, and guess what? We had newspaper headlines around automation and making hands idle, about automation or robots of the kind of machine we had in 1928. Taking people's jobs. And there's a kind of 200-year history, particularly in English-speaking media at least, of this fear of automation coming up at points or times of inequality. And it's just not new. And I like the talk earlier that kind of started to hit on this idea that these fears are part of a structure of human thinking, as opposed to part of a reality of where technology is taking us or pushing us. There's more to where we are taking ourselves. So, to be a bit numerical about this, I wanted to just go through that headline of 50% of jobs. And we did this study actually back in February that looked particularly at Gulf states. And it was found, surprise, surprise, that the same kind of thing came out. So if the UAE population is about 6.3 million, the labor force is about 6.3 million, 2.7 million of those could be automated, according to the study we commissioned. And the same goes for many other countries within the Gulf states. However, in the Middle East and North Africa, there's a large growing youth population. So actually, this might be a somewhat misleading statistic. It's interesting for me when I looked into the equivalent statistics using the same methodology from Osborne and Frey from Oxford. They originally used it for US labor force statistics. Singapore comes out best in the world, so only 25% of labor is likely to be automated given the automation technologies that were considered by the economists who do these kinds of studies. It was interesting reading newspaper articles from Singapore that there's an aim to automate 29% of labor, in that the aim was higher than the predicted percentage by the economists. That tells you a lot about the country's kind of ambitions for using this kind of technology as opposed to fear of it. But digging a bit deeper into that, and I have a less technical picture in a second, so bear with me. One thing to bear in mind is that it's not the number of people or jobs or full occupations that these economists are actually counting. What they count is the tasks you do in a day within each of those occupations. And then they say, and you'll see my previous slide said equivalent to 2.7 million people unemployed. It's not that 2.7 million whole people will be unemployed. It's that a number of tasks in the economy could be done by automated systems. So this is breaking that down a little bit for the Gulf. I'll probably skip over that. But this is the Singapore graph, so I thought I'd stick on this a bit longer. So what this means is that amongst those, if we go to this far end of the graph, amongst those in craftsmen and related trade workers, for instance, it's that you can see a peak around 0.75, that 0.75 or 75%, sorry, of the tasks they do in a day could be automated. So there's actually very few people whose whole job could be automated. There's that very tiny bit right at the end near the 1, which is 100%. And I think that's just worth bearing in mind, and I know this is a bit technical, so I try to draw it out visually, which is actually that for most of us, whether you're in Singapore or the Gulf or elsewhere, so for about 2/3 of us, at least 30% of the tasks we do could be automated. So if you imagine if all the tasks you do in a day with your whole body, up to your knees could be robot. And that goes for most of us. And I think that's a kind of better way round of thinking of it, rather than thinking of number of people who will be sitting by the roadside unemployed, the number of us who get to read a book. Actually, it's only up to your knees that gets to read a book every day, or that percentage of the day, or however you think you can divide up the tasks you do in your labor. But it gets worse than this. My final geeky point is that actually all of these statistical analyses are based on US definitions of what labor is. And I would argue strongly that what I do as a civil servant in the UAE is completely different to what I did as a civil servant in the UK, and certainly different to what my colleagues in the American government are currently having to do. So that idea, and this is the US definition of what an art curator does, in case any of you are interested. In the US, they pull apart those tasks, and they have a set definition, and then they decide which of those are going to be automatable. And when it comes to curators, these may not be the tasks that Honor actually does, or Shumon actually does actually does on a daily basis, but they are the ones defined by economists as those tasks. And so, so when we say that 50% of jobs are going to be automated, there's two things wrong with that, really. The first is it's not really whole jobs. It's tasks within people's jobs. It's the equivalent of that many people being unemployed. And the second is that it requires us to do exactly what those economists have defined as that job. And I think this is a space where we have a much greater agency in our lives, or lack of agency, as this example might prove. So curators are actually 0.68% likely to be automated, which is really low. They're like right at the other end of this graph compared to craftspeople. However, one of the tasks they said that cannot be automated is this category association, which is kind of the association between different objects and putting them together into exhibitions or galleries. And they said this is never going to be automated. Well, Mario Klingman for Google Arts only a few years ago did this project called X Degrees of Separation, where he automated exactly that bit of curation. So he I know it's not all of it, but he took this. You can play with this online. It's really quite fun. So you can take two objects from the collection at the bottom of the screen, and the algorithm that Google and Mario put together will create a visual connection between those two objects. It's not the full form of curation as we know it, but it takes something that we often think of, that kind of notion of association, that we think is a very human thing to do, and that certainly the economists think it's a very human thing to do, and it automates it. It just illustrates for me really nicely that what we might think of as we are being told to be automated really depends on what you decide as part of your practice and what you decide you want to automate. So that kind of brings me to the end of my first point about how creative practice can give us greater agency when it comes to automation. It's inside your own occupation, taking the time and space to decide what you might give to Mario Klingman to automate for you as a fun exercise on a Friday afternoon in your gallery, and what you might keep for yourself to do. And that is still up to you. That is not up to some economists to take away that agency from you, and it's a mistake that we quite often make. Anyway, on to the second of three. To get a bit more political about things, quite often those big decisions about what is automated is not made by us as individuals. We're not all in that luxurious position. It comes down to our leadership, either commercial or political. And this is the point that me and Shimon ended up discussing at length last time, so I've kept it in. There is this quote from Ted Chiang, who's a sci-fi author who lives in Silicon Valley, who was clearly very frustrated earlier this year at some of his friends in Silicon Valley, and saying that actually AI, the problem we have at the moment is that we are subject to the imaginations of those that live in the technology developing parts of the world when it comes to the imagination of how algorithms and automation will occur. And in his case, he was criticizing Silicon Valley for being a no-holds-barred form of capitalism, and that will be the kind of algorithm automation we create. It will not be down to the individual. Now, there was some, actually, since we had the Global Art Forum in Dubai in March, there's been some response to that. So John Evans in TechCrunch has said, this is actually ridiculous. Silicon Valley is nowhere near that kind of Wall Street capitalism. It's a much more sophisticated, goals-driven, values-driven, human-driven enterprise. I'm not going to get into a debate about Silicon Valley or not, but I think it's also interesting from this part of the world where there is a lot of R&D, as we heard earlier today. There is a lot of people producing technology that the values that we bring to that production will manifest themselves in the final products. There's no doubt about that. So if someone in a laboratory here decides to automate a certain kind of manufacturing process, maybe there is an argument that they should be working with those who work inside that process to make that most comfortable for them. Which bit are they going to automate? Maybe it should be the bit that makes those workers most fulfilled, as opposed to the bit that makes that Amazon, Alibaba, whatever worker feel like a cog in a machine. And I think that values-based argument has been around for a while. So this is a great image from a 1965 essay by Peter Drucker, where he makes the argument that time and time and again, we make out like the world is on the kind of cartoon robot above my head, where humans are being spat out by the machine, where humans are being processed by the machine, whereas actually we can, if we decide, make a world where the machine is helping the human do what they want to do, to produce those crafts, to live a happier, smilier, less scared and banged up life. And I think that narrative was there in 1965 is really, really interesting to me. The idea that we can have more political agency, and it's just a question of choice, as opposed to the actions that a technology takes, is hugely important and worth reiterating today, time and time again. So being someone who works in government, I come back to how are our policies today starting to do that. And we've already heard about the new AI ethics and policy committee that was set up here with 2 initiatives. One of which was a research project at Singapore Management University, which is now kicking off. But what struck me in the material around that project, which will last for the next 5 years, is that they focus on a body of knowledge to translate ethical problems into concrete guidelines for corporates or businesses. So even the most research-led philosophical part of this enterprise, this policy enterprise in Singapore, is focused on creating real guidelines for a practical reality. And I think this is where the Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence in the UAE and Singapore are very much aligned. We are both countries where proof of concept for new technology often happens. We're places where that theory and reality, I mean literally taking an algorithm and trying to make it work in a ports and logistics hub for the first time in the world, we are the places that that happens. And we have a space there to join the ethical discussion with the practical discussion, which almost nowhere else does. I'm originally from the UK, and the House of Lords has spent the last year and a half talking about ethics. And they don't even have a framework yet, let alone an ability or even a sense that they should be connecting that with the reality of algorithmic technologies being developed. And that's a real shame. I kind of, you know, I know they're distracted by other things at the moment, but it does make me think again and again that there is something special about policy work in this part of the world, that you can connect it to that reality and make a difference in it. So that's where I feel like the design, that ability to design the right kind of system with the right kind of values could make a serious difference to how automation plays out for all of us. But the final point I wanted to make around how creative practice can affect our agency in automation is around communication skills. I think we've heard today a lot about algorithms and automation, some of which makes sense to us, some of which doesn't. I have a physics degree, and still sometimes it makes sense to me and sometimes it doesn't. And I think there's a role for communication professionals in really starting to pick apart what we mean by an algorithm. And this is a great example. In Europe, a professor who teaches a kind of first-year series in data science worked with a local graphic designer to create these IKEA-like, you may notice, recognize the nomenclature, breakdowns of different kinds of algorithms. And they don't make particular sense at first. I would need someone to also explain this to me verbally. But they are great ways of scanning actually how an algorithmic system works, and the beginning of a discussion of where you would want a human in that system, where you wouldn't want them. If this was applied to child service decision making about whether you decide someone's a vulnerable young person or not, where would you want a human in that system or not? You can only have that discussion if everyone in the room really understands what this technology is. And there are some great moves in that direction. And not to blow Dubai's trumpet too much, but it is one of the things that we're focused on in the foundation, is bringing together the very latest in communication and immersive experience with these technical subjects to try and move the policy debate forward. We have a mini, what we call pop-up museum of the future that we run every year at a big political event called the World Government Summit. And last year we looked at different forms of artificial intelligence and how the human works in the system. And this is a great picture of Omar Al-Allama, our Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence, taking Premier Modi of India around the exhibition. And in this room they're in, you can decide to do different kinds of creative work with an algorithm. You can either draw a picture and allow it to augment it, like a very basic Instagram filter, or you can have your picture taken and allow it to become the artist and take over. And this kind of starts to create discussions around which bit of the creative process would you let an algorithm be part of, which is fun, but it also leads on to more serious discussions in the next room of, if this was applied to political decision making, how much of that would you allow the algorithm to take on? And just by imagining this not quite real product or service yet, it gave those global leaders a moment to think through these things in a kind of material, tangible way, as opposed to an 10 bullet point policy briefing, the kind of thing I would normally produce. And it's certainly more effective. We see India now leading the way, so their main R&D investment is in an AI for social good institute. And that certainly didn't come from this, but it came from a group of people talking about AI and public value at the same time, including demonstrations like this. So those, for me, they're loosely associated forms of creative practice that can help us have greater agency against the automation, against the algorithmic star, or maybe with it. That ability to reimagine my own daily labor, that ability for politicians to really take a lead in the values we imbue in these systems. And finally, using great communication skills to help more people have a discussion about where algorithms fit in all of our lives. But it's not where I wanted to end. Where I wanted to end was on one thing I struggle with in this domain, which is that we still very much admire those with really technical skills, or those with professional skills of particular kinds, from lawyers to doctors. I mean, perhaps there's a better reason for doctors, to bankers sometimes. And I think if we really want to talk about changing how we work with technology, we also need to think about what are the jobs we see as most important in our world. And I think that I love this image from Cartoon Networks. They had an animation event at Garden by the Bay across the road just earlier this year. And this idea that we need to start playing with redrawing the boundaries of our lives, of our daily tasks, if we really want to think about how much we want to give those to others. And that's up to all of us. That redrawing is up to all of us to do. And sometimes it can be a very difficult conversation about, I want to be admired for one thing, a kind of technical expertise in statistics, perhaps in my case. But at the same time, that is probably the easiest thing to automate in my world. And so that's a very tricky decision between how much of my ego I would want to give a robot. Thank you. Thanks, Shima.
Thank you so much. Do you need some water?
I'm okay.
You're okay?
Do you want
Good.
some water?
I'm good. We're going to spend the next 10 minutes sort of going through some of this material, and I'll also open it up to you guys. So if you can start churning your question algorithms, that would be great. I want to start by asking a very simple question, which is, I mean, you sort of called it the algorithm star. We could also call it an asteroid. So if we, I mean, if we're in a position, or certainly people, you know, as well informed as you are, to not only see the asteroid coming towards us, but know exactly what devastating crater it's going to leave. Where are we on the emergency plan? Where are we? And when I say we, perhaps you could start in a kind of more general sense, and then maybe you could sort of you could be more specific in terms of the UAE,
Sure.
Because I thought it was interesting what you mentioned in relation to, you know, your frustrations, let's say, with how the British government are or are not dealing with this, compared to, let's say, the UAE government or the Dubai government. So could you, I mean, it's a major science fiction trope, the inevitable, I mean, it's either an asteroid or some kind of Borg spaceship, and it's coming towards us. And John Cusack has 24 hours to save the world.
Great choice.
Where is John Cusack in the emergency plan? Where are we?
Well, I think he's certainly not taking a coding course online. So there's a way of dealing with algorithms by telling every kid they need to know how to use a basic Scratch coding thing, which is ridiculous. But I do think retraining to some extent, although it sounds a bit boring, is part of this. So I think some of the more sophisticated models for apprenticeships, as actually we're seeing here in Singapore, where you allow people to learn through work, which means they often get a more diverse range of skills. Perhaps they're happier working across technical domains, even if they're not going to be a technician themselves. And that we allow education to just be more diverse, because I don't think we know what's coming. I don't think we know exactly what subjects to teach our kids at school, and that's okay. But if you give them more paths to find their own way, in that flexibility, you're almost giving them a better hoverboard to get away from the asteroid on. But I don't think telling them which path to take on their hoverboard is quite right. And maybe that's my own experience a little bit. I studied both scientific and humanities subjects, and I think that does allow me to flex in my own career between when more scientific disciplines are demanded of me, and that is seen as the way to operate, and then flexing back to more written or commentative work. So yeah, that's how, for the we in general, I think that's a better form of education policy. For the UAE, that's a tricky question. Something that's interesting about the number of engineers in the UAE, so being very, very close to India and having being a safe haven for many people across the Middle East who come from more fragile states. The UAE's got a ridiculous number of engineers, both those with university degrees and those trained as engineers otherwise. And so one of the smarter policies that is starting to be talked about in the UAE is a training of AI-ready individuals. So those who have a better understanding of newer disciplines coming along. They may have only worked on some kind of other database system in the past, and you're upskilling them. And I think that's a very interesting regional opportunity where you already have a lot of people with a technical background, which is not the case in Europe or America, that should be taken advantage of.
And you mentioned education, and I wanted to sort of dwell on that a little bit, but specifically in relation to an announcement that was made, I think last week or the week before, by Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, who has announced that in a year's time he will step down and he will dedicate himself in a kind of philanthropic manner, and his subject will be education. I then learnt that prior to founding Alibaba, he was an English teacher. And this put into light something very interesting, which was his statement that he made at the World Economic Forum back in January, a kind of message. So clearly it was a sort of, a prelude to this recent announcement. But at Davos, he said in very unequivocal terms that when it comes to education, the worst thing that we could do, and certainly that we could do as parents or as governments that have to write national curricula, is this idea that education and that good education of a good child is to entirely endow them with only technological, kind of technological education, right? So that they're very good coders or et cetera, et cetera. And that, the rest of the things, anything linked to humanities would be put to the side. He said the very opposite. He said that if you, if you only, most of the computational tasks, as you suggested, are already being eclipsed by automation and will be the case more and more and more in the future. He suggested education really needs to focus on the things where machine learning, AI are decades, if not even centuries away from kind of figuring out, right? Which are things like ethics, which are things like sociology, which are, hardcore rationalists would have called fuzzy subjects once, When I told my parents I wanted to study art or English literature, as a good Bengali, as son of good Bengali immigrants, no way, right? Because those are fuzzy subjects. But what I'm very interested and also very delighted that someone like Jack Ma, who is making this statement and suggesting, well, no, actually, wait. This teleological notion of a future which self-replicates itself is the worst direction to take, And that education really needs to be thought about, in a sense, through the blind spots, the still blind spots of where AI are possible. So I wonder where you sit on that.
I think I have a clarification, I guess, and then a somewhat of an answer. So I find it a little bit tricky to talk in terms of blind spots because, as the curation example showed me, at least, if not everyone, that there are bits of things that we think of as AI being decades away from that they may be able to pick off. And I think we have to be careful calling all of humanities or all of ethics something that could not benefit from some kind of system that is, I don't know, I don't really know ethics and automation, how you do that, but, but I just think categorizing things so clearly and saying that all creative professionals are okay and will not be automated is really bad. There's a lot of design work that becomes rote work at some point, if we admit it, and that those elements can be automated, and we just have to be a bit careful that we don't lump things together in too bigger lumps, because it's probably not the right way to have the discussion. But no, I like the jet bomb comment, and I think there's one human I will use as an example. I will find her name afterwards and share it with you, but I can never remember. It's Catherine something or other. She did her PhD in comparative literature at Stanford, which is a weird thing to do, because Stanford is known as a computer science school. It's in the belly of Silicon Valley. It's part of that world. And in fact, the economic crisis happened, I'm not sure this was entirely relevant, but that was the era that she was doing her PhD. And all of the careers advice for her from Stanford was like, oh great, so you know about words, so you can go and work in social media marketing. Or did you know that university administration is a decent career for someone who knows about words? Whereas her colleagues doing PhDs in computer science in almost the same laboratory were being, offered millions of dollars to go and work in this startup or that. But actually Catherine has ended up, despite these misgivings of a careers advisor, she's fairly senior position at Google, because what they found that, well, she made sure that people found out, was that her understanding of categories, of the way that words and language operates, was far more valuable to Google than many of her computer science peers. And actually that ability to understand how humans communicate, in her case in a fairly computerized way or automated way, it did help, means that she is now much better paid, thank goodness, than many of those colleagues. So I think, it's a one-person example, it's not a statistic, but the idea that those skills are important, I think, is great, and particularly partly inspired by the recent discussion of metaphysics this afternoon. Those that are able to think in categories, are able to define problems well, define the complexity, or break down the complexities of human life, or complexities of our ecosystems. Those are invaluable, because those are the people that understand how to break down a problem that you could give to an algorithm. And that task of the breaking down is the thing we seem to not be able to automate or give to any kind of computer system well at this point in time. So I definitely would bang the drum for humanities education, but I like to follow specific examples to it, because I think generalizing too much takes away from the importance of certain steps along those examples.
For sure, but I think that there has been the humanities have been at the receiving end of a tendency of generalization as well, right? So, which is that, and this would be my last question actually, which is about culture. Okay. And so, one could argue that a certain form of middle class culture is a byproduct of something that starts in the Industrial Revolution, which is the notion of free time or of leisure time. And that the millions of people that go to Tate Modern or MoMA or come here are able to do so because on the one hand, they have work that gives them a living to put food on their tables, but also that they have time off work to then also spend the money they hopefully haven't blown entirely on their groceries to come here and enjoy something like culture. Now, someone like Elon Musk ends up pushing this in a kind of very accelerationist way and sort of suggests, well, what's wrong with us all being having 100% leisure time, because that means we can all go to the museum all the time. But that discounts actually the significance of work as a form of culture.
Yeah, totally.
And also as a form of meaning and identity. And so I just wanted, the last question was really about, because I think one of the things we talked about in March was the relationship between work and culture and identity, and I wondered whether you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, well, I think you put that very well. I think that I do worry, I guess I'm a bit of a UBI cynic, and it's just, it probably doesn't come from a logical position. It comes from, there are many other solutions for providing financial support to people, and the recourse just to a single solution is not clever policy making, in my view. But putting that aside, the idea that we have that we do see work as part of identity. I do, and I think most people around me do. And I see, I don't know, I think of people who take off a year for maternity leave as a really nice example of a group of people who are away from work for a while, but supported, at least in the UK, you get a year off and you can come back to your job. And they do lose identity, or in some cases they form brilliant new ones, but not most cases. And I think that kind of, I think that's hugely important, and having some way to use and augment what you do at work using algorithms or robots or automated technology is great. But if someone else is in charge of how that moves into your world, we should be honest about how that affects our identity as much as just the number of tasks we do in a day, because the two are so tightly connected. So I guess I agree with you, although I wouldn't probably use Elon Musk as an example.
We have time for one or two questions. Marlies, as terse as possible, thank you.
Thank you. I would have two questions actually and one remark.
Okay.
Remark first on the last section. I think that meaningful work must not be tied to income. It is tied to culture and identity, obviously, but as we heard earlier in some of the discussions about value, but also about the notion of the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, meaningful work nowadays, many people like housewives, mothers, social caretakers, if you care for your grandma, it's also work, but it's not paid, it's not, how do you call that in English?
Remunerated.
Exactly. So it is meaningful work. And I think we will not lose work, but in danger, as the titles of your talk said, are jobs. And the question is how to deal with that and how automatization could help us deal with that. And the second, the question actually, and tied to that, may be a little controversial, but I'm still going to ask it. We heard about national strategies for AI in Dubai and also in Singapore. And I assume that some wealthy and technologically advanced states will follow. Me being from Austria, which will not adopt an AI policy very soon, I assume. So how about migration issues and thinking about the future, you know? So if there are states that are more forward in their use of technology, possibly ethical use of technology, how will these states plan to deal with the other people from other states that might want to move to Dubai and Singapore suddenly because of the beneficials that come from it? I know it's a tough one. I don't know if you're the right person to ask.
Yeah, answering the second one first, which I might sound like I'm dodging it. I don't think I am. Which is that if people wanted to come to Dubai and work in those new jobs, perhaps that have come from those technologies growing up there, if they have the skills that are demanded to work on that, they'd be very welcome. But these are states with fairly strict visa policies at the moment, and so they won't be a place where people would come and get an UBI because it's made other people. I don't know even quite how that would work. But yes, I would imagine that it would be along the lines of those who can support the new kinds of services or products that come from those technologies would come in, but the same kind of visa stuff applies, that your job and your visa and your ability to enter a country are one and the same.
Also, apart from jobs, like, you know, shouldn't there be the assumption of a transnational AI strategy, a global one? You know, that's what I actually meant. Not only about jobs, but, you know, about the ethical use of technology nowadays and for the future. Can it be left in the hands of certain states that can afford to put the money into research, or should they give it as a commons to the whole planet? I don't know, it's just a thought. Yeah.
Well, completely, but we can't even agree. I mean, we're now, it seems we're well into the next era of globalization, which is turning globalization back, or certainly by the champions of 20th century globalization. You know, at Davos last year, this year, Jack Ma's presentation stuck in my head. A year ago, it was President Xi Jinping who stood up as the defender of globalization. You know, in light of Trump's recent election and his very adamant kind of retraction from you know, further global trade pacts, etc., into a kind of nationalist self-contained. So, you know, we're living in, obviously, in extremely accelerating and uncertain times where the kind of benchmarks and the markers of the 20th century are completely upside down. I couldn't agree with you more, but there seems so little potential at the moment for kind of global cooperation. One would find it even harder to believe that certainly at the state level, and perhaps this is where non-state actors have to come in, right?
So I would say there's an interesting, when we talk about the relationship between science and politics, you often talk about science for politics or politics for science. I think in this case, scientists for diplomacy, you could call it, is an interesting layer to think about. So how scientists from different nations are working on the same projects themselves. Sometimes that's because they all work for Facebook, so you know, you can take what you will from that. But that layer, creating a global network when at a time when states are not going to be doing that, is very interesting, and there's some positive developments. I think positive developments in that domain.
And second question, finally tied to the notion of creativity, which also popped up in, will creativity help us kill the algorithmic star or asteroid? So the question is, how do we redefine creativity, I think, because it's always tied to, and I work as a curator in an art museum and design museum, to the arts, basically. So everyone is afraid of the term creative because it's so much tied to the creative industries, the arts, but creativity applies even if you're a carpenter or to the most simple tasks in life. You can be creative with feeding your child and while vacuum cleaning, I don't know. So it's like, we need to really put that term more out there and
I'm really
drive it away from the creative fields that are known as such, right?
Yes.
What's your take on it?
I'm glad you bring that up because I was worried by using the example of curators, I would make that look like I make that confusion. But absolutely, when it comes to reimagining the tasks you do every day, that creative or imagining, that's not just for those who work in creative occupations. That's kind of, you'd need to be creative on creative. That doesn't make any sense. It should be for everyone. I think only the final category, when we talk about clearer communication of what an algorithm is, that was talking about those that have very specific kinds of communication and design skills, which probably do fit most naturally in those creative professions. But the other two categories, everyone, for sure. And creativity is part of most people's work, not just creative professionals, absolutely.
We've run out of time. Will you please join me in thanking Jess Bland? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shimon.
If I could ask Noah and Marlies maybe to come up on stage. And just as a wrap-up, we're now at the end of day one of our talks program. One more chair. That would be great. And we promise not to keep you survivors that much longer. The evening clearly beckons, but we thought it would be interesting for some kind of already retrospective remarks, and then I'll ask Marlies in particular an honor to give us a preview about what we're going to be thinking and talking about tomorrow. But maybe we could start with you, Noah. What have been some of your kind of responses and cogitations as we've gone through the afternoon today?
I think the theme that has stuck with me quite profoundly, everything from Volker's presentation this morning on through to the discussion about the metaphysics of the market and Jessica's presentation here, was actually how despite the fact that it looks like there are greater and greater areas of influence and control through AI or through robotics or through automation and aspects of our lives, both personal and professional, you know, the enduring theme of all of these was one of agency and opportunity, actually. From a small scale about redefining what it is that we do in our day-to-day lives as the more banal and mundane tasks of our daily life are automated to the national scale as redefining a national vision about who we want to be as a people, who we want to be as a country, and where we want to go and the role we want to play in the world. And I think that's tremendously refreshing because most of the conversations around these topics are often, as many other colleagues have pointed out, quite fraught with anxiety and fear and paranoia even, that can lead to resistance and perhaps counterproductive political conversations around this. So I think it's very reassuring that from such a broad spectrum of thinkers, from market philosophers to historians to quantitative researchers themselves, that we realize that this is a future that is up to us to write, right? There is no predestination or predetermination in this, and that's extremely exciting because it's just a reconfiguration of the tools that we have available to help achieve our personal visions, our family visions, our national visions, or indeed our aspirations for what we want the world to become.
Anna?
Although, one of the things that was really running through my head when Volker was speaking about, kind of perhaps some of the more, kind of utopian opportunities that, kind of may lie in the future with automation, giving us a new leisure class, with UBI kind of giving us the kind of flexibility and freedom to perhaps, kind of go fishing and read books, is that the kind of the elephant in the room here is we're assuming that this is, business as usual and that we still have a viable planet, to live on. And, that hasn't come up in today's presentations. It might come up in the next couple of days, but we are looking at a future, kind of globally, not just in Singapore, not just in UAE, but globally, which is significantly different to the one that, kind of we exist in today, and perhaps, kind of different from those epochs that we were looking at in Volker's slides as well. We may not be looking at a continuum of, kind of rapid improvement, acceleration, kind of and kind of technological positivism. And I think that's worth bearing in mind, kind of like as a backdrop or a landscape or, quite literally an ecology where we're, having these conversations about the transformation of our jobs. It really plays to Jess's points about, kind of what do we value, kind of within our identities, within our skill sets right now. We may, kind of today, kind of really value that JavaScript course that we did, kind of in 2016. But it might be farming skills that will be more useful, kind of going into, kind of a world that's sort of transformed by the kinds of forces that we see at play today. So I think, it was nice to have that conversation around value and what in ourselves do we value and what of those skills, kind of might be useful in the future.
And Marlies, maybe you give us, both your thoughts about the day, but as Anna alluded to, what we're looking forward to tomorrow.
Also that, just one remark on the values or skills of the 21st century we might need. Maybe a more holistic look at the world, to see the connections, like, the networked world. And one of the greatest minds, Paul Virilio, just recently passed, who spoke of acceleration, as Volker also pointed out very early on, to not look only at the moment and at the skills that are needed at the moment. We made that mistake with the huge specialization issues, but to look at the broader picture and to not go back to a 19th century education, I won't say that, but deepen and broaden our spectrum, and also what is claimed often, like bring designers into politics, bring scientists into politics. It's now done slowly, step by step, but I think that's a point, this more holistic worldview that we should embrace more, and it makes us human as well. And as for the outlook of tomorrow, so I'm gonna just announced that I will be speaking about 2 recent exhibitions at MAC Vienna that will also touch on the notion of RV artificial, one of them being Hello Robot, design between human and machine. Design as a category, as a mediator between technology and the human, and how we put products to use, how they seduce us to be used in the right or wrong ways. And the other one other exhibition called Artificial Tears, where I touched on the notion of humanness and how embodiment, is very important still, how we not only think and feel with our minds and the brain, but the whole spectrum, which then ties in nicely to the panel discussion I will lead, preceded by presentations by Wong Chun Yu and Suk-Wen Chang, who performed yesterday, and a short intro by Professor David Hu. And I heard that we will also be joined by a non-human being on stage, more on that tomorrow. And the panel is being called "We Are in a Robotic Moment," and it will have much to do with embodiment and the extension of man through our technology.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sticking it out till the very, very end. It's exactly 7 o'clock. We hope to see you here tomorrow. If not tomorrow, we hope to see you on Sunday. Thanks everyone at the back of the room for everything that you've done. Have a very good evening. Bye-bye.